If you sink this ball, I'll give you $10K. Richard Whitmore's mocking laugh carried across the manicured grounds of Palm Crest Golf Club. Annie looked toward the flag at the 18th hole, then back at him. "What are you staring at?" Richard said, raising his voice when she didn't answer. $10,000 is probably more than you make in a year picking up balls for rich men. I'm giving you a chance here. A little encouragement. A way to show off whatever talent you've got for collecting things off the grass. He tilted his head, smiling as the men behind him began to laugh. Or is that too much money for you to even think straight? Annie stood with the basket lowered at her side. "Sir," Annie said calmly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was only helping." "Oh, were you?" Richard cut in, pointing the head of his club toward her. "A minute ago, you were pretty eager to touch my ball. So let's see what you can do with it." "I already told you, sir. I thought it was one of the range balls. I was helping Mr. Samuel." "Come on, girl," Richard said, waving one hand as if brushing away an insect. "Don't pretend. I can see what you are. The clothes, the basket, the way you're wandering around where you don't belong. Some people are meant for the clubhouse, and some people are meant for the tool shed." One of his partners, a heavy man with a red face and a drink in his hand, let out a loud laugh. "That's generous of you, Whitmore," the man said, "giving a ball girl a chance to perform on a gentleman's course." The obese man standing beside Richard looked toward the flag whipping hard in the wind, then let out a mocking laugh. "Richard, look at that wind," he said, swirling the champagne in his glass. "It's cutting straight across the fairway. Even a decent golfer would think twice before taking that shot." Richard curled his lips, his eyes still fixed on Annie. The obese man continued, his voice dripping with ridicule. "And this is the 18th hole, for God's sake. A par 5. Long fairway, nasty crosswind, sand traps waiting near the approach, and a green sloped just enough to punish anyone stupid enough to be arrogant." He glanced Annie up and down, then laughed. "Experienced golfers respect this hole, Richard. Men who have played for 20 years still lose money here, and that little ball girl thinks she can walk up, hold a club, and sink it like she was born on a country club lawn?" Richard gave a cold smile. "That's exactly why I chose it. Let her show us what she can do." Annie looked straight at him. Her face did not change. Her eyes stayed clear, steady, almost gentle. "I don't need your money, sir," she said, "and I'm not a ball attendant here." Richard laughed harder, stepping closer now. "Oh, now we've got pride," he said. "If you're not picking up balls, then what are you? Don't dress like help, and get offended when people treat you like help." Mr. Harris, the club manager, was already hurrying across the cart path, his face pale beneath his visor. He knew Annie. He knew exactly who her father was. "Mr. Whitmore," Harris called, trying to keep his voice professional. "There has been a serious misunderstanding, Miss—" Annie raised one hand without taking her eyes off Richard. Harris stopped. For a moment, his expression begged her to let him speak. "Let me fix this. Let me tell him who you are." But Annie gave the smallest shake of her head. Richard noticed the exchange and mistook it for fear. "Oh, now the manager's nervous," he said, turning back to his partners. "See? This is what happens. You try to give someone a little opportunity, and everyone gets sensitive." "I don't need an opportunity from you," Annie said. The words were not loud, but they cut through the laughter before it could start again. Richard's smile tightened. "Is that right?" "Yes, sir." He lifted a ball from the grass and held it between two fingers. "Fine," he said. "You want to stand here like you know the game? Let's make it interesting." "Mr. Whitmore," Harris said, stepping forward. "I really must object." Richard did not even look at him. "Relax, Harris. I'm encouraging young talent." Annie studied him. "That's what you call this?" "That's exactly what I call it." He pointed his club down the fairway. 18. "From here. Sink it, and I'll give you $10,000. He paused, enjoying the widening eyes of the men behind him. "Miss it, and you walk away. No attitude, no excuses, and you don't come back wandering around places where you don't belong." The silver-haired partner laughed again, though softer this time. "From here? That's not a shot. That's a miracle." Richard chuckled. "Then I suppose she has nothing to worry about." Harris came close enough to speak under his breath. "Miss Annie, you do not have to do this. I know. Your father will be here any minute. This isn't about my father." Harris swallowed. Richard tossed his driver down at her feet. Not handed. Tossed. The polished shaft hit the grass and rolled once against her shoe. "Try not to scratch it," he said. A few of the men laughed because they did not know what else to do with the shame beginning to creep into the moment. Annie looked down at the club. She set the basket of balls gently on the grass. Then she bent, picked up the club, and weighed it in her hands. Her shoulders settled. Her fingers found the grip without searching. The man with the phone stopped smiling. The silver-haired partner leaned forward. Richard's face changed by a fraction. She placed the ball. The laughter had thinned now, replaced by the restless silence that comes before a storm or a verdict. Annie stepped behind the ball and looked down the fairway. Annie took her stance. "Look at that, Richard," the silver-haired partner said, swirling the bourbon in his glass as if the whole scene had been arranged for his amusement. "The ball girl is actually taking this seriously. She probably doesn't even know which end of the club to hold. And now she's studying the 18th like she's on Sunday at Augusta." Richard laughed, loud enough for a pair of older members near the cart path to turn their heads. Annie had taken only 3 steps toward the teeing ground when he moved in front of her, blocking her path. "You know," he said, lifting his chin toward the driver in his hand, "this club costs more than half a year of whatever they pay you to pick up after men like me, so be careful. I'd hate for those dirty little hands to ruin something you couldn't replace in 10 lifetimes." Annie stopped about 2 steps away from him. She did not step back. Her face stayed calm, almost still. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "if you've made the challenge, please move aside and let me take the shot." The heavyset partner burst out laughing and slapped Richard on the shoulder hard enough to make the ice in his drink jump. "Did you hear that? She told you to move aside. That's the problem these days. People don't know respect anymore. Give them 1 minute on a private course, and they start acting like royalty." The club dropped to the grass at Annie's feet. A few of the men laughed before it even stopped rolling. "Pick it up," Richard said. "I'm feeling generous today. I'll let someone like you touch a luxury item once in your life. Consider it a favor from Richard Whitmore himself. Pick it up, swing properly, and try not to break my $1,000 driver." "That is charity," the heavyset man said, grinning. "She's probably never even seen $10,000 in one place." $10,000, Annie repeated softly. There was no hunger in her voice, no excitement. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "do you really believe everything in this world can be measured by paper?" Richard's face tightened. "Don't start preaching to me," he snapped. $10,000 is more than enough for a lesson about where you stand in society. Look at yourself, your clothes, your attitude. Wandering around Palm Crest like this is some public park on the wrong side of town." He stepped closer. Annie could smell expensive cologne, cigar smoke, and the sharp trace of liquor beneath his words. "This is Palm Crest," he said. "This place was built for people with education, money, and standing, people who understand tradition. Someone like you should be grateful to carry a basket here, not stand around talking back to members." "Exactly," the heavyset man said, nodding as if Richard had delivered a sermon. "It's ridiculous. A ball girl arguing with a billionaire." Annie's face remained composed, but something in her eyes had changed. Not anger, not fear, recognition. "My skin and my clothes don't define my value, sir," she said. "But the way you use money to humiliate people says a great deal about yours. My parents taught me that a real gentleman doesn't need to bully an 18-year-old girl to feel tall. If you feel for Annie in this moment, please like this video. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because someone near you might be watching this story too." Richard's face flushed. The veins in his neck stood out. "You think you can lecture me?" he said. He spun toward the cart path and shouted, "Harris, where did this trash come from? Why is she wandering around the 18th hole? Get her off this course right now." Mr. Harris moved forward, pale beneath his visor. His hands were held slightly out, not quite pleading, not quite surrendering. "Mr. Whitmore," he said carefully, "I don't think we need to make this worse. She is—" Richard cut him off with a hard wave of his hand. "What are you afraid of? I'm a VIP guest here. I pay more in annual fees than most people make in 5 years. I have every right to ask that eyesores be removed from my game." He leaned closer to Harris, lowering his voice just enough to make it more threatening. "Are you defending her against me?" Or would you like to explain to the board why you can't control your own course? Harris swallowed. His eyes flicked to Annie, then back to Richard. That is not what I meant, he said. But, Mr. Whitmore, you truly do not know who she... Uncle Harris, Annie said gently. The manager stopped. She did not look away from Richard. Let him talk. I want to hear how far Mr. Whitmore is willing to go. Harris stood there for a moment, caught between duty and dread. Then he stepped back, his jaw tight, his expression almost sorrowful. Richard mistook the silence for victory. There, he said, turning back to Annie. At least someone here still understands authority. He pointed toward the 18th hole, where the flag snapped hard against the wind. You want to prove me wrong? Fine. Here's the challenge again. From here, put that ball in the hole. Do it. And the $10,000 is yours. I'll even apologize for underestimating you. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. But if you miss, or if you don't have the nerve to swing, you walk out of Palm Crest and never come back. This course has no room for people who confuse charity with equality. The heavyset partner let out a low whistle. The silver-haired man gave a laugh that sounded thinner than before. Annie looked at each of them, one by one, then back at Richard. I want everyone here to witness what Mr. Whitmore just promised, she said. A billionaire's word should mean something. Richard sneered. It does. Good, Annie said. Then I hope you don't regret giving it. She bent and picked up the driver. The laughter began again, but it did not last. Her feet found the turf with quiet certainty. She did not fumble with the club, did not test it like a stranger, did not ask where to stand. She weighed it once in her hands, glanced toward the wind, then toward the distant flag. The silver-haired partner stopped swirling his drink. Richard's smile held, but only because pride kept it there. Annie placed the ball, stepped behind it, and looked down the fairway. The 18th stretched before her in the hard afternoon light, long, narrow, and waiting. Behind her, Mr. Harris held his breath. Richard crossed his arms, and Annie prepared to swing. Annie did not swing right away. She let the silence settle first, because silence had weight, and right then, everyone on that fairway was carrying some part of it. The driver felt slightly heavier than what she was used to. Richard had chosen it for show, not balance. The shaft was expensive, the finish flawless, the grip too new, the kind of club a man bought to be seen carrying it. Annie rolled her fingers once around the handle and felt what mattered. Weight, length, flex. The club would do what it was told if the person holding it knew how to speak its language. Behind her, Richard gave a dry laugh. Taking your time, aren't you? He said. Don't worry, sweetheart. The hole won't get any closer. The heavyset partner chuckled again, though his laughter had lost some of its body. He had expected Annie to hold the driver awkwardly, maybe put her hands in the wrong place, maybe ask where to stand. Instead, she was studying the fairway with the quiet focus of someone who had stopped hearing them. Annie shifted her feet. The grass beneath her was tight and fast, cut so clean it seemed painted onto the earth. The wind came hard from the right, then pushed back toward her face, changing just enough to make the shot cruel. The flag at 18 leaned, snapped straight, then leaned again. Most players would aim safe. But safe would not reach the hole. Safe would leave the ball short, buried in the slope, or caught by the bunker guarding the front left. She had one ball, one swing, one promise from a man who never expected to honor it. Mr. Harris stood near the cart path, his hands clasped in front of him. He wanted to stop this, but the moment had moved beyond management. He could see it now. There were times when a person had to be protected, and there were times when a person had chosen to stand. Annie had chosen. All he could do was watch and hope Richard Whitmore understood what he had invited before it was too late. Annie looked once toward the clubhouse. The white columns rose in the distance, bright under the sun. Somewhere inside, her father was in a meeting with board members who still believed they were negotiating the future of Palm Crest. They were talking about transition plans, youth access, staff wages, legal language, endowment funds, the sort of words adults used when they wanted change to sound orderly. Annie respected that work, but out here, change had become less orderly. It had a face, a voice, a man in pressed khakis telling her she did not belong. Her mother would have hated the way Richard spoke, not because Evelyn Reed was easily offended, but because she believed language could either lift the world or poison it. Annie could almost hear her now, standing in the kitchen back home, turning from the stove with a wooden spoon in her hand. Don't let ugly make you ugly, baby. That's how it wins. Annie breathed in through her nose, slow and steady. Richard saw her pause and mistook it for doubt. Changed your mind? He called. No shame in admitting you're out of your depth. Well, maybe a little shame. The silver-haired partner smiled, but his eyes stayed on Annie's hands. He had played enough golf to know what he was seeing, even if he did not want to say it out loud. Her left wrist was firm. Her grip was clean. Her shoulders were relaxed in a way amateurs never managed when people were watching. Richard, he murmured. Maybe we should just let this go. Richard turned his head sharply. What? I said maybe we've had our fun. Richard's face hardened. No. She wanted to prove something. Let her. Annie heard that. She heard the small crack in the confidence behind it. That was the thing about men like Richard. They could laugh at you all day, if they thought the ending belonged to them. The moment the ending became uncertain, the laughter started looking for a door. She stepped to the ball. The fairway stretched long and narrow, framed by palms and low white sand. Beyond it, the green waited like a secret. She did not think about the $10,000. She did not think about the men. She thought about Samuel's hand trembling in the grass. She thought about the way he had whispered balls while lying half-conscious, afraid his work would be left unfinished. She thought about every person who had ever bent their back to keep a beautiful place beautiful, while other people walked past them without learning their names. Then she thought about her father. Jonathan Reed had taught her golf before he taught her how rare it was for people like them to be welcomed into certain rooms. When Annie was 7, he put a cut-down iron in her hands and told her the ball did not care what anyone called her. At 12, after a parent at a junior tournament asked if she was there to carry someone's bag, he sat with her on the tailgate of their SUV and said, "You don't swing to answer fools. You swing because the game deserves your best." At 16, when she lost a championship by one stroke and cried into a towel where nobody could see, he told her, "A good golfer learns the wind. A strong person learns insult. Neither one gets to choose your direction." Now the wind pressed against her face, and insult stood behind her with crossed arms. Annie set the club behind the ball. The man with the phone raised it again, but he was no longer smiling. He wanted proof now, not comedy. Richard glanced at his partners. "Watch this," he said, but his voice had gone dry. Annie drew the club back halfway, then stopped. Richard laughed too quickly. "What's wrong?" Annie stepped away from the ball and looked at him. "For clarity," she said, "this is still your challenge." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Of course it is. And if the ball goes in, you will pay $10,000? "Yes," he snapped, "if it goes in." And everyone here heard that? She turned slightly, not pleading, not performing, just letting the question rest among the men who had laughed a few minutes earlier. The heavy-set partner lifted his glass. "We heard it." The silver-haired man gave a small nod. "Yes," Mr. Harris said quietly. "I heard it." Annie looked back at Richard. "Thank you." That simple thank you irritated him more than any insult could have. It sounded too much like control. "Hit the ball," he said. Annie returned to her stance. This time she did not stop. The driver rose in a smooth arc. Not rushed. Not forced. Her shoulders turned, hips following with clean restraint. The motion compact, but loaded with power. For half a second, everything held together in perfect stillness. Annie's eyes on the ball, the wind across the grass. Richard's smile frozen on his face. Harris watching like a man afraid to breathe. Then Annie swung. The sound was not loud, but it was pure. A sharp crack cut through the fairway as the club met the ball dead center. The ball launched low at first, boring into the wind instead of rising helplessly into it. Then it climbed, catching its line, turning against the sky with a controlled draw that made the silver-haired partner whisper something under his breath. Richard's arms fell from his chest. The heavy-set man lowered his drink. The ball kept going. It carried the first stretch of fairway, cleared the narrow bend, and rode the wind as if Annie had not fought it but persuaded it. For a moment, even the course seemed to watch. The carts stopped on the path. A groundskeeper near the bunker straightened. Two women on the terrace turned toward the sound and shaded their eyes. Annie did not move from her finish. Her body held the pose, balanced, quiet, certain. The ball dropped onto the far edge of the fairway, kicked forward, and kept running. Richard swallowed. No, he muttered it. But the ball was not finished. It rolled toward the green, slowing just enough as it reached the slope. The flag snapped hard once, then settled. The ball turned left, then softened right, following a line so delicate it seemed less like luck than memory. Nobody laughed now. The ball reached the green. It kept rolling. The cup waited, and every man who had mistaken Annie Reed for someone beneath him leaned forward as if the world itself had narrowed to that small white ball crossing the grass. The ball slowed at the lip of the cup. For one long second, it seemed to rest there, half in shadow, half in sunlight, as if even the ball understood the weight of what it was about to do. Richard's mouth opened. The heavy-set partner stopped breathing through his laugh. "Mr." Harris pressed one hand against his chest. Then the ball dropped. A small, clean sound rose from the 18th green. Click. That was all. No thunder. No music. No speech from heaven. Just a white ball falling into a cup on a private golf course in Palm Beach. But the sound cut through every insult Richard Whitmore had thrown, every laugh his partners had offered, every silent compromise made by men who knew better and chose comfort anyway. For a moment, nobody moved. Annie lowered the driver. The wind came across the fairway again, lifting the edge of her shirt, brushing against the grass, carrying the silence farther than any applause could have gone. She did not smile. She did not raise her hands. She did not turn to the men and ask if they had seen it. She only stood there, balanced and calm, as if the shot had done exactly what she had asked of it. The silver-haired partner was the first to speak, though his voice had almost disappeared. "My God," he said. That went in. The heavy-set man blinked at the distant green, then at Annie, then at the empty teeing ground in front of her. His drink hung forgotten in one hand. A drop of condensation slid down the glass and fell onto his shoe. "That's impossible," he muttered. "No," Mr. Harris said quietly, though no one had asked him. "It's not." Richard turned toward him. The manager did not lower his eyes this time. Richard looked back down the fairway. His face had gone pale beneath the tan, but his anger arrived quickly, rushing in to cover the shock. Men like him did not know what to do with being wrong. They only knew how to become louder. "That was a lucky bounce," he said. No one answered. He forced a laugh, short and brittle. "Come on. We all saw it. The ball caught the slope. That's not skill. That's a fluke." The silver-haired partners stared at him. "Richard," she carried the wind. She landed it exactly where it needed to land. Richard's head snapped toward him. "Don't start. I'm just saying." "I said don't start." The words came out sharp enough to end the exchange. The silver-haired man looked away, but not before Annie saw something pass across his face. Shame. Maybe. Or the realization that he had spent years laughing at men like Richard because it was easier than standing apart from them. Annie walked toward Richard and held the driver out to him. "Grip first." "Your club," she said. He did not take it. Up close, she could see the sweat at his temple, the small twitch near his jaw. He looked less like a king now, and more like a man trying to hold a mask against a strong wind. "You really think you've done something," he said. "I made the shot. You got lucky. I made the shot you challenged me to make." The heavy-set partner cleared his throat. "Well, technically, Richard, she did." Richard turned on him. "Are you her lawyer now?" The man lifted both hands and stepped back. "I'm just saying there were witnesses." "Witnesses to a joke," Richard snapped. He looked around at the small group that had gathered. 2 older members by the cart path, a groundskeeper near the bunker, a young caddy standing with his mouth slightly open. Miss Harris still rigid beside the path. It was a joke. Nobody with a brain would think I was seriously handing $10,000 to some girl who picked up a club one time and got lucky. Annie's eyes stayed on him. "A joke usually ends with everyone laughing," she said. Richard leaned closer. "Careful." "Why?" "Because you're still standing on private property. And you're still standing in front of witnesses." That landed harder than she expected. Richard's eyes flicked toward his partners, then to Mr. Harris, then toward the clubhouse. His mind was no longer on the money. It was on control. Who had it? Who had lost it? Who had seen? He reached for the driver at last, but instead of taking it gently, he snatched it from her hand. "You people love making everything dramatic," he said. "I gave you a little attention, and now you think you're owed something." Annie heard the shift. "You people." There it was, no longer dressed in jokes or country club language. The truth had slipped out of his mouth because pressure had squeezed it loose. Mr. Harris stepped forward. "Mr. Whitmore, that is enough." Richard turned slowly. "Excuse me?" "I said that is enough." The manager's voice shook, but only a little. He was an older man, and the fear in him was not cowardice. It was the fear of someone who had worked too many years in rooms where rich anger could cost ordinary people their jobs. Still, he stood there. Richard smiled without warmth. "You want to choose sides, Harris? I am choosing the rules of this club. I am this club. Men like me keep places like this alive." "No," Harris said, glancing toward Samuel's empty basket on the grass. "Men like Samuel do." The sentence quieted the fairway again. Richard's face flushed dark red. For a moment, Annie thought he might actually strike the old manager with the club in his hand. Instead, he pointed it toward Harris like an accusation. "You forget who you're talking to." "No, sir," Harris said. "For the first time today, I believe I remember exactly who I'm talking to." The silver-haired partner exhaled. The heavy-set man looked down into his glass again, suddenly fascinated by the melting ice. Richard laughed, but there was no strength behind it now. "Fine. You all want to turn this into some moral performance? Here it is." She hit a lucky shot. "Congratulations." He gave Annie a slow, mocking clap. "There? Happy?" "You promised $10,000, Annie said, "and I said it was a joke. You said if I sank the ball, the money was mine." Richard lowered his voice. "And who are you going to tell? Your supervisor? The help desk? Some little social media crowd that gets bored by dinner?" Annie studied him for a moment. She was not surprised anymore. That made her sadder than anger would have. "My father once told me," she said, "a promise only reveals its value when keeping it costs you something. I don't care what your father told you." "You might." Richard stared at her. Before he could answer, a low hum came from the cart path beyond the bend. Everyone turned. 3 golf carts were approaching from the direction of the clubhouse. They were not the small 2-seat carts used by members during casual rounds. These were larger, polished, driven by club staff in formal green jackets. In the front cart sat 2 board members Annie recognized from that morning. In the second sat a woman from the legal team, holding a folder tight against her lap. And in the last cart, sitting upright with one hand resting on his knee, was Jonathan Reed. Mr. Harris saw him and closed his eyes for the briefest second. Richard saw him too. The change in Richard was immediate. His shoulders pulled back, his chin lifted. He smoothed the front of his polo with one hand and tried to rearrange his face into the expression of a man who had not spent the last 20 minutes humiliating a young woman in public. "Well," he said under his breath, almost to himself. Finally, the cart stopped near the teeing ground. Jonathan Reed stepped down slowly. He was tall, with gray at his temples and the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself. Men in Richard's world had been trying to get 5 private minutes with him for months. Richard had sent emails, made calls, donated to the right committees, appeared at the right dinners. He wanted Jonathan's approval because Jonathan Reed's approval opened doors that money alone could not. Richard moved first, his smile returning too quickly. "Mr. Reed," he said, extending his hand. "What an honor. I was hoping we'd have a chance to." Jonathan walked past him. He went straight to Annie. His eyes moved once over her face, checking not for injury, but for the kind of wound that does not show on skin. "Annie," he said, voice low, "are you all right?" The fairway seemed to tilt under Richard's feet. Annie nodded. "I'm all right, Dad." The word struck harder than the shot. "Dad." The heavy-set partner's glass slipped from his hand and landed in the grass without breaking. The silver-haired man stared at Annie, as if seeing her for the first time. "Mr." Harris bowed his head, not in fear now, but in relief. Richard stood frozen, his outstretched hand still hanging in the air. Jonathan placed a hand gently on Annie's shoulder, then turned to face the men gathered around them. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice even, "this is my daughter, Annie Reed." No one spoke. Jonathan's gaze moved from Richard to the distant 18th green, then back again. "And from what I just heard on the radio," he continued, "she has done exactly what Mr. Whitmore challenged her to do." Richard did not move for several seconds. His hand remained half raised where Jonathan had walked past it, fingers slightly curled, as if his body had not yet received the news that the handshake was no longer coming. "Your daughter," he said at last. Jonathan looked at him. Yes. The word was simple, but it changed the temperature of the fairway. The men who had laughed with Richard now stood like schoolboys caught near a broken window. The heavy-set partner bent awkwardly to retrieve his glass from the grass. The silver-haired man stared toward the 18th green, where the flag still moved in the wind above the cup that had swallowed Annie's ball. Richard forced a laugh, but it came out thin. "Well then," he said, smoothing his shirt again. "This is clearly an unfortunate misunderstanding." Annie looked at him. "Was it?" Richard's smile faltered. Jonathan did not speak for her. He kept his hand on her shoulder for one more second, then let it fall. It was a small gesture, but everyone saw it. Annie was his daughter, yes, but she was not a child hiding behind him. She stood on her own feet. Richard shifted his weight. "Miss Reed, had I known who you were—" "That's the problem," Annie said. His mouth closed. "You didn't know who I was," she continued, her voice steady. "So you decided I was someone you could insult." The board members in the cart exchanged a look. Mr. Harris lowered his eyes. Not out of fear now, but because the truth had been placed in the open and there was no polite way to pretend it was not there. Richard glanced at the others, measuring the damage. "Now, let's not twist this. I saw a young woman picking up balls where members were playing. I had concerns. Any reasonable person would. You didn't ask my name," Annie said. "You didn't ask why I was helping. You didn't ask if Mr. Samuel was all right. You looked at me and decided what I was worth." The heavy-set partner opened his mouth, perhaps to help Richard, then thought better of it. Jonathan turned slightly toward Mr. Harris. "Where is Samuel?" "In the staff room, sir," Harris said. "He's awake. Dehydrated, but stable. I had medical staff check him. We're arranging for him to be taken home." Annie's face softened for the first time. "Good." Richard saw the softness and tried to use it. "See? That's what matters. The man is fine. The girl is fine. The shot was impressive. No harm done." Jonathan's eyes settled on him. "No harm?" Richard swallowed, but recovered. Men like him did not survive in business without learning how to dress retreat as reason. "I mean no permanent harm," he said. "Everyone got carried away. Golf course banter. You know how it is." "I know exactly how it is," Jonathan said. Something in his tone made Richard stop smiling. Jonathan looked around the group. His voice stayed calm, but it carried across the teeing ground without effort. A young woman helped an employee who collapsed in the heat. She picked up the work he was afraid to leave unfinished. Then she was mistaken for staff and insulted for it. When she corrected that mistake, the insults got worse. When she was challenged in public, she accepted. When she succeeded, the man who challenged her called his own promise a joke. Nobody interrupted him. The legal woman in the second cart wrote something in a folder. Richard noticed and stiffened. "Is this really necessary?" Jonathan turned back to him. "You made it necessary." Richard gave a short laugh and lowered his voice, though not enough to keep others from hearing. "Mr. Reed, surely two men in our positions can discuss this privately." Annie's eyes moved to her father. Jonathan shook his head once. "You did not speak to my daughter privately." Richard's jaw tightened. "You did not humiliate her privately," Jonathan continued. "You did not make your challenge privately. So no, Mr. Whitmore, I don't believe privacy is where this belongs." The silver-haired partner shifted, then said quietly, "Richard, you should just pay it." Richard turned on him. "Stay out of this." "I was in it when I laughed," the man said. That was the first honest thing anyone in Richard's group had said all afternoon. It surprised even him. He looked down at the grass after saying it, as if ashamed it had taken so long. Annie watched him for a moment. She did not thank him. Some truths did not deserve applause just because they arrived late. Richard's anger was no longer hidden. "This is absurd. You all want to act like I committed a crime because I made a joke on a golf course. A joke doesn't tell someone they don't belong because of how they look," Annie said. "I never said that. You said enough. You're putting words in my mouth." "No," Mr. Harris said. Richard spun toward him. Harris's voice was quiet but clear. "No, sir. She is not. The fairway held still again. Harris looked older in that moment, but not weaker. I heard what you said. So did your guests. So did the caddy. So did the groundskeeper by the bunker. You told her people like her should be grateful to carry a basket here. You told her this place was for people with education, money, and standing. You told her she did not belong. Richard stared at him with open disbelief. You work for this club. Yes, Harris said, and today, for once, I'm going to act like that means protecting its standards. Jonathan nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Richard saw it, and that seemed to frighten him more than Harris's words. He turned back to Jonathan, speaking faster now. Mr. Reed, I have been pursuing membership here in good faith. I've supported the club. I've attended every fundraiser. I was prepared to make a significant contribution to the youth development wing. The one my foundation is restructuring? Jonathan asked. Richard hesitated. Yes, exactly, that one. Annie looked at him. You were going to donate to youth access while telling me people like me didn't belong on the course? Richard flushed again. I did not know you were a champion golfer. You shouldn't have needed to. Jonathan looked at his daughter then, and something like pride passed through his face, restrained but deep. Annie had not raised her voice once. She had not called Richard names. She had simply kept handing him the truth until he could no longer pretend it was anything else. The heavy-set partner cleared his throat. For what it's worth, Richard. The girl made the shot. We all heard the terms. Richard glared at him. You too? The man lifted both hands. I'm not losing my reputation over your temper. There it was. Not courage, exactly. Self-preservation. But sometimes even self-preservation helped move a lie out of the way. Jonathan turned to Richard. Richard's lips parted. Annie raised one hand slightly. I don't need him on his knees. Richard's eyes flashed, as if even mercy offended him. I don't, Annie said. An apology forced from the mouth isn't worth much. But the promise is public. The money should be paid. To you? Richard asked, the bitterness returning. No. That caught him. Annie looked toward the cart path, in the direction of the staff room, to Samuel, and to the caddies, groundskeepers, and ball attendants who work in this heat while men like you forget they have names. The silence after that was different. It did not accuse. It asked everyone present what they had overlooked. Jonathan's expression softened, but he said nothing. This was Annie's decision. Mr. Harris blinked quickly and looked away. Richard gave a hard, humorless laugh. So now I'm funding the staff? You're keeping your word, Annie said. What happens to the money after that is not your concern. The legal woman stepped down from the cart and opened her folder. Mr. Whitmore, a personal check will be sufficient, or we can process a transfer through the club office with witnesses present. Richard stared at her. Who are you? Elaine Porter, counsel for Reed Foundation. His face changed again. The name landed where pride could not block it. Reed Foundation. Not a rumor anymore. Not a future possibility. Present tense. He looked from Elaine to Jonathan, then to the board members, then to Harris. The ground beneath his ambition had begun to move. This is ridiculous, he said, but the force had left the words. Jonathan spoke gently, which somehow made it worse. No, Mr. Whitmore. This is accountability. Richard stood there with the driver still in his hand, the same driver he had dropped at Annie's feet minutes earlier. Now it looked less like a symbol of status and more like evidence. The silver-haired partner reached into his jacket and removed a pen. He held it out without looking at Richard. For a moment, Richard did not take it. Then he did. Elaine produced a blank check from Richard's assistant, who had arrived in the second cart looking as if he wished he had chosen another profession. Richard snatched it, bent over the small writing surface of the cart, and began to fill it out with hard, angry strokes. $10,000. Payable as directed to the Palmcrest Employee Relief Fund, with Samuel Turner named first among the recipients. When Richard finished, he tore the check free and held it out toward Annie, as if daring her to take pleasure in it. She did not reach for it. Give it to Mr. Harris, she said. Richard's hand tightened around the paper. Then, with visible effort, he turned and handed it to the manager. Harris accepted it with both hands, as if it were not a check but a long overdue correction. Annie looked once at Richard. Thank you for keeping your word. He flinched, not because the words were cruel, but because they were not. Then the breeze shifted across the 18th hole, carrying with it the smell of cut grass, hot pavement, and something changing beneath the polished surface of Palm Crest. Richard had paid the money, but everyone on that fairway could feel that the $10,000 was not the end of what he had lost. Richard's hand remained empty after he gave the check to Harris. It was a small thing, a piece of paper gone from his fingers. But the loss seemed to confuse him. Men like Richard were used to money leaving their hands and returning as obedience, applause, access, silence. This check had bought none of those things. It had only confirmed what everyone had witnessed. Harris folded the check once and placed it carefully inside his jacket pocket. His hands were steady now. A few minutes earlier, he had looked like a man balancing his job against his conscience. Now he looked like someone who had finally set one of those things down. "Mr. Harris," Annie said, "please make sure Samuel knows it came from the promise, not charity." Harris nodded. "I will." Richard gave a low laugh. "Of course. Dress it up however you want. Make me the villain and the staff the heroes. That's what this is now, isn't it?" Jonathan turned toward him. "No one had to make you anything, Mr. Whitmore." Richard's face tightened. "I've donated more money to this club than most members have ever earned. I've sponsored events here. I've hosted investors here. I've brought attention to Palm Crest." "You brought attention today," Annie said. He looked at her sharply. She did not look away. There was no triumph in her expression, only a calm that unsettled him more than anger would have. Richard knew how to fight anger. He could belittle it, call it emotional, accuse it of being ungrateful, but calm gave him nothing to grab. The board members stepped down from their cart. One was a woman in her 70s named Margaret Bell, who had been part of Palm Crest longer than Richard had been wealthy. She carried herself with the kind of old Southern restraint that made every word feel measured before it was allowed out. The other, Thomas Keene, was a retired judge with silver eyebrows and a habit of listening longer than most people liked. Margaret looked first at Annie, then at Jonathan. "We heard there was an incident." Jonathan's eyes stayed on Richard. "You heard correctly." Richard turned to Margaret as if she might still be useful. "Margaret, this has been blown completely out of proportion. I made a remark. She made a remarkable shot. The matter is settled." "Is it?" Margaret asked. The question was gentle. That made it dangerous. Richard forced a smile. "I paid the money." Thomas Keene glanced toward Harris. "After denying the promise?" Richard's smile disappeared. "Judge, with all due respect," this was informal banter on a golf course. Thomas looked toward the 18th green. "Banter tends not to include banishment." The silver-haired partner looked down. The heavy-set one rubbed the back of his neck and said nothing. Annie watched the adults speak around the wound Richard had made. That was how places like Palm Crest had survived for so long. They knew how to soften sharp things with proper language. Incident, misunderstanding, banter, poor choice of words. She had heard those phrases in tournaments, in school meetings, in charity dinners where people praised opportunity while locking the door from the inside. Her mother had once told her, "Be careful when people rename cruelty. They do it so they won't have to repent for it." Annie thought of Samuel again. She pictured his hands, rough at the knuckles, still reaching toward spilled golf balls while his body was trying to shut down. She wondered how many years he had been invisible on this course. She wondered how many men had called him by the wrong name and still expected him to smile. Jonathan seemed to know where her thoughts had gone. He looked at Harris. "Take us to Samuel, when we're done here." "Yes, sir." Richard let out an impatient breath. "Are we really turning a round of golf into a labor hearing now?" Margaret's eyes cooled. "A man collapsed from heat on our grounds today, Richard, and I'm sure the staff is handling it." "The staff," Annie said, "is the reason this place looks perfect while people like you complain about where the ball lands." For the first time, Margaret's mouth moved as if she nearly smiled. She did not, but the corner softened. Richard pointed at Annie, then stopped himself when he realized how it looked. He lowered his hand. "You are very comfortable speaking to people above your station." Jonathan's voice cut in before Annie could answer. "There it is again." Richard blinked. "What?" "Your favorite word without saying it. Station, place, belonging. You keep circling the same idea, Mr. Whitmore, that certain people are born to stand on the tee box, and others are born to keep the grass clean around it." Richard's eyes flashed. "Don't lecture me about birth. I built everything I have." And then decided no one else deserved room to rise, Jonathan said. That sentence landed hard. Even Richard's partners looked at him differently. They knew the story he liked to tell at dinners. How he had built himself from nothing, how no one gave him anything, how he respected grit above pedigree. Yet on the fairway, faced with a young black woman he mistook for staff, he had become the locked door he once claimed to hate. Richard's voice dropped. You don't know me. I know what you did when you thought my daughter had no power. Annie looked at her father then. His face was composed, but she could see the anger beneath it. Jonathan Reed was not a man who raised his voice often. He did not need to. He had spent his life moving through rooms where men tested his patience and called it conversation. He had learned to carry fury without spilling it. Annie had inherited that from him, though her mother always said Annie carried it with more grace than either of them deserved. Elaine Porter stepped closer with the folder in her arms. Mr. Reed, the transition documents are ready for signature inside. The board has already approved the final transfer pending the public announcement. Richard stared at her. Transfer? No one answered at once. The silence widened. Richard looked from Elaine to Margaret, then to Thomas Keene. What transfer? Margaret straightened. Palmcrest has entered into a controlling partnership with the Reed Foundation. Richard's face emptied. That's not possible, Thomas said. It is already approved. Richard gave a hard laugh. No. I would have heard about this. You were not on the board, Margaret said. I was applying for VIP membership. Yes, she said. You were. The past tense did not pass unnoticed. Richard turned to Jonathan, and for the first time that afternoon, there was something close to fear in his eyes. Not fear for his safety, fear of exclusion, fear of the door closing from the inside while he stood on the wrong side of it. Jonathan spoke evenly. As of tomorrow morning, the Reed Foundation will oversee Palmcrest's operations, community access initiatives, youth development programs, and membership standards. Annie felt every eye shift toward her, some with surprise, some with embarrassment. Harris already knew, but even he looked moved hearing it said aloud on the grass where Samuel had nearly fainted and Richard had thrown a club at her feet. Richard swallowed. You're turning this place into some public charity course? No, Jonathan said. We're turning it into what it should have been all along, a course with standards that include character. Richard's laugh came out broken. Character doesn't pay for fairways. No, Annie said. But people do. The ones you don't see. Harris looked toward the staff path. A groundskeeper stood near the bunker with his rake in hand, pretending not to listen and failing. A young caddy had edged closer, still holding a towel. On the terrace, two older women had gone quiet over their iced tea. The whole club seemed to be listening now, from the polished porch to the sand traps, Richard noticed. His humiliation was no longer contained to a small circle of partners. It had spread across the place he wanted to conquer. He stepped toward Jonathan. You can't deny my membership over a misunderstanding. Jonathan looked at Annie. I won't decide that alone. Richard frowned. What does that mean? Annie turned to him. It means tomorrow, this club begins a new youth access program. I'll be helping oversee it. You? Richard said before he could stop himself. Yes. His eyes moved over her again. But now the same details betrayed him differently. The plain clothes, the old shoes, the calm face. None of them meant what he had decided they meant. None of them ever had, Annie continued. And the first standard of that program is simple. No child who walks through these gates will be treated like they have to prove they're human before they're allowed to play. Margaret looked down at the grass. Thomas Keene nodded once. Richard said nothing. Annie stepped closer, just enough that he had to meet her eyes. You told me not to come back to places like this, she said. That may be difficult, Mr. Whitmore, because as of tomorrow, this place will be part of my work. The words did not need to be loud. They moved through the fairway with more force than Richard's shouting had. Harris drew a slow breath. Elaine closed her folder. Richard's partners stood silent, each man calculating how far away from him he needed to be by dinner. Richard's face had gone pale again. You're enjoying this. Annie shook her head. No. I wish you had chosen better. That seemed to strike him harder than if she had insulted him. For one brief second, something human flickered behind his anger. Something wounded and old. But pride rushed in and smothered it. Jonathan turned to Harris. Please inform security that Mr. Whitmore's guest privileges are suspended pending formal review. Richard's head snapped toward him. You can't be serious. I am. My membership application, Margaret answered this time, will not proceed. The heavyset partner muttered something under his breath and stepped farther back. The silver-haired man removed his cap, though nobody had asked him to. Perhaps he did it out of discomfort. Perhaps respect. Perhaps because the sun suddenly felt harsher than it had before. Richard looked around for one friendly face and found none. The 18th hole stood behind Annie in the distance, quiet after doing its part. The check rested in Harris's jacket. Samuel waited in the staff room. The club Richard had tried to use as a mirror for his importance had just shown him something else. He turned away first. No apology came. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But the silence that followed him as he walked toward his cart was not the silence of defeat alone. It was the silence of witnesses remembering. And sometimes, in places built to forget, remembering was the beginning of justice. Richard's cart rolled away from the 18th tee with less speed than anger required. He sat stiffly in the passenger seat while his assistant drove, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed ahead as though the fairway itself had betrayed him. Nobody called after him. Nobody tried to soften the moment. For a man who had spent his life making entrances and exits that people noticed, the quiet was a worse punishment than applause. Annie watched until the cart curved past the palms and disappeared toward the clubhouse road. She did not feel victory. Not the kind people imagined. Anyway, there was no thrill in watching a man lose face after he had tried to take yours. There was only the heavy relief of a storm moving a few miles down the coast, still visible, still dangerous, but no longer directly overhead. Jonathan stood beside her, hands loose at his sides. He did not ask if she was all right again. He knew she had answered once, and he knew his daughter well enough not to crowd her with concern in front of people who had already stared too long. Margaret Bell broke the silence first. "Miss Reed," she said, using the formal tone older Southern women used when respect mattered. "That was one of the finest shots I have seen on this course." Annie turned to her. "Thank you, ma'am." Thomas Keene gave a small nod. And one of the finest refusals to be diminished. Annie did not know what to say to that. So she said the truest thing. "I wish it hadn't been necessary." "So do I," Thomas said. The silver-haired partner approached slowly, his cap in one hand. Without Richard beside him, he looked smaller, not physically, but morally exposed. He stopped a few feet from Annie and cleared his throat. "My name is Charles Bennett," he said. "I owe you an apology." Annie waited. Charles glanced down at the grass, then back at her. "I laughed. At the beginning. I told myself it was harmless because I wasn't the one saying the worst of it. But I laughed." The heavyset partner remained near the carts, pretending to check his phone, though everyone knew he was listening. Annie looked at Charles for a long moment. Why? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He had expected dismissal, perhaps a gracious acceptance. Something that would let him leave quickly, with the wound covered. Why did I laugh? Yes. He pressed his lips together. Because Richard is useful. Because I've done business with him. Because it was easier to laugh than be the first man to stop. Annie nodded once. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was recognition. That's usually how it happens. Charles took that in. "I'm sorry." "Then remember it," Annie said. "Next time, be early." His face tightened, not in offense, but because the words had found their mark. "I will try." "No," Jonathan said quietly. "Trying is what people say when they want credit before the work." "Do it." Charles looked at him, then nodded. "Yes, sir." The heavyset man finally walked over, his cheeks still red. "Look, Miss Reed, things got out of hand. I didn't mean anything personal." Annie turned toward him. "You said I probably hadn't seen $10,000 in one place." He shifted. "It was a joke. No. It was a guess about my life. You made it because of what you thought I was." He opened his mouth, closed it, then looked toward Jonathan as if hoping for rescue from a father who would smooth the edges. Jonathan offered none. "I apologize," the man said at last. "For what I said." Annie held his gaze. "Apology accepted. Trust is not included." His eyes dropped. "Fair enough." Mr. Harris touched the check inside his jacket as if reminding himself it was still there. Miss Annie, Mr. Reed, Samuel is in the staff room. I think he'd like to know what happened, though I'm not sure how much we should tell him all at once. Tell him the truth, Annie said. But gently, Harris gave the smallest smile. That I can do. They began walking toward the clubhouse, not as a procession, but people fell into place anyway. Jonathan and Annie walked side by side. Harris walked slightly ahead, guiding them along the cart path. Margaret and Thomas followed with Elaine Porter. Behind them, Charles and the heavyset man remained near the tee, left with their own silence. As they passed the practice range, Annie saw the place where Samuel had fallen. The grass had already been cleared. The scattered balls were gone. Someone had set the basket upright near the bench as if order could erase what had happened there. Annie slowed. Jonathan noticed. You saw him fall? Yes. How long before anyone else stopped? Annie looked toward the clubhouse terrace. A few members were still watching, though they turned away when they realized she could see them. Long enough. Jonathan's face hardened, but his voice stayed calm. That changes today. It has to change more than today. It will. She wanted to believe him. Not because she doubted her father, but because she knew institutions had a way of praising reform while protecting habit. The Reed Foundation could buy controlling interest. It could revise policy, fund programs, raise wages, open gates. But culture lived in smaller things. Whether a member learned a groundskeeper's name, whether a caddy could report mistreatment without fear, whether a young girl from the wrong zip code felt welcome before she won anything. Jonathan seemed to hear that thought without her saying it. Ownership opens the door, he said. It doesn't clean the house. Annie glanced at him. Mom said something like that once. Your mother said most true things before I had the good sense to repeat them. That made Annie smile despite the ache in her chest. The staff room sat behind the main building, past the polished dining room and the pro shop windows where shirts cost more than some families spent on groceries. The hallway narrowed as they moved away from the member areas. The floors changed from stone to plain tile. The air smelled of coffee, detergent, sunscreen, and cut grass carried in on work shoes. Samuel was sitting in a vinyl chair with an ice pack behind his neck and a paper cup of water in both hands. A young caddy stood near him, hovering like a grandson. When Samuel saw Annie, he tried to rise. No, sir, Annie said quickly. Please stay seated. Samuel eased back down, embarrassed. Miss, I heard some noise out there. Mr. Harris told me you took care of my basket. I only picked up a few balls. The caddy blurted. She hit an albatross on 18. Samuel blinked. She what? Harris shot the boy a look, but it was too late. Annie gave a small shrug. Mr. Whitmore made a challenge. Samuel's face changed when he heard the name. Fear passed through it first. Old and practiced. I hope I didn't cause trouble. That sentence hurt more than Richard's insults. Annie crouched in front of him so he would not have to look up. You didn't cause trouble, she said. You collapsed in the heat. That means the trouble was already here. Samuel looked at Jonathan then, recognizing him slowly. His eyes widened. Mr. Reed. Jonathan stepped forward and shook his hand with both of his. Samuel, I'm sorry it took a day like this for us to sit in this room. Samuel gave a tired laugh. Rooms like this don't usually get visitors from men like you. They will now, Jonathan said. Mr. Harris removed the check from his jacket. Mr. Whitmore made a public promise. Miss Annie asked that the money go to the staff relief fund, starting with you. Samuel stared at the check. His mouth trembled slightly. I don't need charity, Annie smiled softly. That's what I told Mr. Harris to make clear. It isn't charity. Its wages dignity should have paid a long time ago. The room went quiet. The caddy looked at the floor. Harris pressed his lips together. Even Elaine Porter, who had probably seen every kind of settlement paper, looked away for a moment. Samuel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed by the tears. Your parents raised you right. Annie looked at Jonathan. They tried. Jonathan's voice thickened just enough for her to hear. Still trying. Samuel leaned back, the ice pack slipping slightly. That man Whitmore always spoke hard to folks. Most of us just learned to step aside. I know, Harris said quietly. Samuel looked at him, not accusing, just tired. Yes, sir. I think you do. Harris absorbed that. For a man his age, the sentence carried years. Times he had looked away. Times he had chosen keeping peace over making it right. He nodded slowly. "I'm sorry, Sam." Samuel studied him, then gave a small nod. "Then make it better for the young ones." Harris looked toward the caddy, then back at Samuel. "I will." Annie stood. Through the small staff room window, she could see a strip of the course, green and perfect under the sun. From a distance, Palm Crest looked unchanged, but inside this plain room, with a tired old worker holding a cup of water and a check folded on the table, something had shifted. Justice had not arrived with trumpets. It had walked in through the back hallway, carrying the smell of grass and heat, asking people to say names they should have known already. Samuel kept both hands around the paper cup even after the water was gone. It was not thirst anymore. It was something to hold on to while the room shifted around him. For years, the staff room had been a place where workers lowered their voices and swallowed what they could not afford to say. Now Jonathan Reed stood beside the bulletin board with the faded emergency numbers, and Annie stood near the door with grass stains on her shoes. And Mr. Harris looked like a man finally hearing the echo of every complaint he had called minor. Elaine Porter set her folder on the small table. "Mr. Reed, we should talk through immediate measures before the announcement. After what happened today, waiting would be unwise." Jonathan nodded. "Then we don't wait." Harris straightened. "Sir, I can call department heads in within the hour." "Not department heads first," Annie said. The room turned to her. She glanced at Samuel, then at the young caddy, then at the row of lockers with names written on strips of tape. "Ask the workers what they need before deciding what to give them. Otherwise, it's just another policy written by people who don't stand in the heat." Samuel looked down at his empty cup. "She's right." Harris accepted that with a small nod. "Yes, she is." The young caddy, whose name tag read Marcus, shifted near the counter. He was maybe 16, thin as a rail, with nervous eyes and a towel twisted in both hands. "Can I say something?" Jonathan turned to him. "Please." Marcus swallowed. "The water coolers on the back 9 run out almost every weekend. Nobody wants to radio it in because members complain if carts take too long. And some caddies skip lunch when the pace is backed up." Harris closed his eyes briefly. "Marcus, it's true," Samuel said. "Boys telling the truth." Annie leaned against the wall, listening. That was the part people often skipped. They loved speeches about dignity. But dignity started with hearing a hungry teenager say he skipped lunch so a wealthy man's round would not be delayed. Jonathan looked to Elaine. "Write that down." Elaine already was. The door opened a few inches, and a woman in a laundry uniform peered inside. Her name was Darlene. Annie remembered from earlier. She had brought ice when Samuel collapsed. "Sorry," Darlene said. "Didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting," Jonathan said. Darlene hesitated. "Some of the kitchen staff heard Mr. Reed was here. They're asking if Samuel's okay." "I'm all right," Samuel called, though his voice was still thin. Darlene looked relieved, then glanced at Annie. "And they heard about the shot." Marcus could not help himself. "Albatross." Darlene's eyebrows rose. "Lord have mercy." For the first time since entering the room, Samuel laughed. It was weak, but real. The sound loosened something. Even Harris smiled for half a second. Jonathan said, "Darlene, will you ask anyone off shift to join us? No pressure. We're making immediate changes. And I would rather hear from the people who live with the consequences." Darlene studied him, as if deciding whether a man in his position could mean a sentence like that. "Yes, sir. I'll tell them." When she left, Annie looked through the small window again. Beyond the glass, Palm Crest moved as if nothing had happened. A cart crossed toward the 10th hole. A server in white carried a tray toward the terrace. Somewhere, someone laughed, too loudly over lunch. The surface stayed polished. That was the problem with polished places. They could reflect sunlight and hide rot at the same time. Her father came to stand beside her. "You're quiet." "I'm thinking. That usually means someone is about to have more work." She almost smiled. "Good." He looked at her shoes. "You never did change before walking the course." I wasn't planning to become part of the staff. No, he said. You were planning to avoid the reception. That too. Jonathan's expression softened. Your mother would say you found the more important room. Annie swallowed. She missed Evelyn most in moments like this. When doing the right thing did not feel clean or simple. When victory came with the taste of other people's pain. Her mother had been gone 3 years, but sometimes her absence entered a room before anyone else. Evelyn Reed would have known what to say to Samuel. She would have known how to comfort Harris without letting him off too easily. She would have looked at Richard Whitmore once and understood the wound beneath the cruelty without excusing a single word. She would have hated what he said, Annie murmured. Yes. She also would have told me not to hate him. Jonathan took a breath. Your mother was better at that than I am. Annie looked at him. Are you angry? Yes. At him? At him. At myself. At this club. At every room I've sat in where men used softer words to protect the same old habits. His voice stayed low. I came here today to sign papers. You found the truth those papers need to answer. Before Annie could respond, Darlene returned with 3 more employees. A kitchen worker named Luis, a groundskeeper named Ben, and a woman from housekeeping named Ruth, who looked to be in her late 50s and carried herself with the guarded dignity of someone used to being overlooked by design. They entered carefully, not sure if they were allowed to sit. Jonathan noticed. Please sit if you'd like. Nobody did at first. Samuel patted the chair beside him. Sit down, Ruth. If they fire us all, at least we'll be rested. The room laughed softly. Ruth sat. Jonathan folded his hands in front of him. I'll be direct. The Reed Foundation's transition begins tomorrow. What happened to Samuel today made clear that some changes can't wait. We need to hear what is broken. Luis looked at Harris. Harris gave him a nod. The heat schedule, Luis said. Kitchen gets hot. Outside gets worse. Staff are afraid to ask for breaks when events run behind. Ben added, equipment's old. Shade tents are stored but hardly used because members say they spoil the look of the course. Ruth's voice was quiet. Some members speak to staff like we're furniture. Not all, but enough. People report it. Then nothing happens because the member is important. Harris looked as if every sentence cost him. That has happened. Ruth turned to him. More than happened, Mr. Harris. It became expected. No one spoke for a moment. Then Harris nodded. You're right. That admission changed his face. It did not fix anything, but it removed one stone from the wall. Elaine looked up from her notes. Immediate action items. Heat safety protocol. Mandatory water checks every hour. Protected meal breaks. Member conduct reporting system. No retaliation. Staff relief fund. Equipment review. Shade station. Add names, Annie said. Elaine glanced at her. Names? Jonathan asked. Members and guests should learn staff names. Not numbers. Not boy. Not girl. Not the cart guy. Names. She looked at Samuel. People treat what they can. Keep nameless as disposable. Ruth pressed her lips together and looked away, but not before Annie saw her eyes shine. Jonathan nodded. At it. Marcus spoke again, braver now. What about the youth program? Annie turned. What about it? I heard rumors that kids from outside Palmcrest might get to train here. That's true. Marcus looked embarrassed by his own hope. My little sister can putt. Not fancy, but she's good. We can't afford lessons. Annie's face softened. How old is she? 12. What's her name? Jada. Annie smiled. Then Jada should come to the first clinic. Marcus looked at Jonathan, as if needing confirmation from someone older and official. Jonathan said, Jada will be welcome. The boy's shoulders dropped in relief so sudden it was almost painful to watch. Outside the staff room, footsteps approached. Elaine looked through the open door and stiffened slightly. Charles Bennett stood in the hallway, cap in hand. I'm sorry, he said. May I come in? The room went cautious. Jonathan did not answer immediately. He looked at Annie. She considered Charles, the man who had laughed, and then admitted why. Yes, she said. But listen before you talk. Charles stepped inside. He looked at Samuel first. Mr. Turner, I owe you an apology too. I've played here 12 years, and I'm not sure I ever asked your last name. Gia, I will. I, and, ID, IT, you, IT. Samuel studied him. It's Turner. Yes, sir. Samuel Turner. Samuel gave a small nod. Now you know. Charles looked at Jonathan. I want to contribute to the relief fund, not to clean my conscience. I don't think checks do that. But because I should have done it years ago. Annie watched him closely. Then make it recurring. And anonymous. Charles blinked. Anonymous? If you need credit, it's still about you. A slow, chastened smile crossed his face. Your mother must be something. She was, Annie said. The past tense settled gently in the room. Charles understood enough not to ask. He nodded. Anonymous, then. Recurring. Harris looked around the staff room. Samuel with his ice pack. Marcus with new hope for his sister. Ruth sitting straighter than when she came in. Jonathan listening instead of commanding. Annie in the same simple clothes Richard had mocked. The room was too small for what had begun there, but maybe that was fitting. Most honest things started in rooms powerful people rarely entered. Jonathan closed the meeting by saying, tomorrow we make the public announcement. Today we start with water, breaks, shade, and respect. If we can't do those things immediately, we have no business promising anything larger. No one applauded. It would have felt wrong. Instead, people nodded, the way working people do when they hear something that might become real if enough people keep their word. Annie stepped back into the hallway with her father. The polished member areas waited beyond the turn, shining and cool. Behind her, the staff room remained warm, crowded, and awake. For the first time all day, Palmcrest felt less like a monument and more like a place that could still be saved. The hallway outside the staff room led back toward the polished heart of Palmcrest. Annie had walked through many private clubs in her life, but that passage felt different from the others. Behind her were lockers with taped names, coffee cooling in paper cups, and people who had just said out loud what they had carried quietly for years. Ahead of her were framed tournament photos, brass plaques, and members who had paid heavily for comfort and called it tradition. Jonathan walked beside her without rushing. He had always moved that way when something important was happening, as if speed belonged to panic, and he refused to give panic a vote. You did well in there, he said. Annie looked ahead. I didn't do much. You listened. Most people in charge forget that part. They were waiting for permission to tell the truth. Yes, Jonathan said, and too many of us made them wait. Annie heard the us. Her father did not excuse himself, even when the fault was shared by a room larger than him. That was one reason people respected him. He took responsibility before anyone could force it into his hands. As they passed the pro shop, a few members looked up from racks of shirts and gloves. Word had traveled faster than carts. It always did in places where people pretended not to gossip. A woman in pearls whispered something to her husband. A man near the register stared at Annie's shoes, then looked away when she caught him. Annie did not slow down. She had already spent enough of the day being inspected. Margaret Bell waited near the entrance to the boardroom with Thomas Keene and Elaine Porter. The boardroom doors were open, and inside, a long mahogany table had been set with folders, water glasses, and silver pens arranged with the seriousness people gave to documents that changed ownership without making noise. Margaret touched Annie lightly on the arm. Before we go in, I want to say something. Annie turned. Yes, ma'am. I have been part of this club for 37 years, Margaret said. Long enough to love parts of it, and long enough to be ashamed of parts I learned to look past. Thomas lowered his chin, listening. Margaret continued. My husband used to say Palmcrest was a place where gentlemen came to be better than they were during the work week. But over the years, I watched too many men come here and become worse because nobody corrected them. Annie did not interrupt. Older people often needed time to speak the truth because it had been sitting in them too long. What happened today should have been stopped before you had to lift that club, Margaret said. By me, by Harris, by anyone who heard enough. I am sorry it wasn't. Annie accepted the words with a small nod. Thank you. Margaret seemed to understand that thank you was not absolution. It was only a door left open. Inside the boardroom, the air was cool enough to raise goosebumps on Annie's arms. The contrast bothered her. Samuel had collapsed in the sun while this room sat chilled and ready. the water glasses sweating neatly on coasters. She sat beside Jonathan, not at the back, not near the wall, but at the table. Elaine placed a folder in front of each person. Richard's name appeared on one sheet under pending VIP candidates. It was printed cleanly, without any hint of the ugliness attached to it now. Thomas saw Annie looking at it. That file will be closed. Jonathan opened his folder. Formally? Yes, Thomas said. The membership committee can cite conduct unbecoming, violation of guest standards, and harassment of a guest and staff. Not harassment of staff alone, Annie said. The room turned to her. She tapped the table once, lightly. If the rule only becomes serious because he said it to me, we've learned nothing. Margaret's face tightened, but not with anger. With recognition, Annie continued. Richard thought I was staff. That was why he felt safe saying it. So the violation should protect the person he thought he was insulting, not just the person I turned out to be. Thomas looked at Elaine. Can we word it that way? Elaine was already writing. Yes, we should. Jonathan looked at Annie, and pride flickered across his face before he returned to the papers. Then that is how it will read. The meeting began. But it did not feel like the morning meeting Annie had avoided. There was less ceremony now. The legal terms still came, but they no longer floated above life. Controlling partnership, operational transition, conduct reform, employee safety, youth access. Each phrase had Samuel's face behind it, Marcus's sister behind it, Richard's voice behind it. Elaine reviewed the first emergency actions. Water stations on every third hole by the following morning. Mandatory heat breaks for grounds and cart staff. No member could refuse or penalize a staff delay for medical or safety reasons. A confidential reporting line would open within 48 hours, monitored outside club management. Staff names would be required on updated member guides, not as labels for service, but as recognition of the people who kept the course alive. Margaret lifted a hand. Some members will resist. Jonathan said, then they can resist elsewhere. It was the shortest sentence in the meeting, and perhaps the clearest. Thomas moved to the youth program. The Open Fairway Initiative launch was scheduled for next month. Given today, do we move it forward? Jonathan looked to Annie. What do you think? Annie leaned back. She thought of Marcus asking about Jada. She thought of children standing outside fences, watching a sport that had priced them out before they ever touched a club. Announce it tomorrow, she said. But don't make it look like a reaction to Richard. Make it clear this was already planned. He didn't inspire it. He exposed why it matters. Elaine nodded. That's the right message. Margaret looked at Annie with new interest. Have you considered speaking at the announcement? Annie almost said no. Public speaking had never been her favorite thing. People assumed athletes enjoyed attention, but Annie liked the part before applause. The focus, the quiet, the private bargain between body and discipline. Microphones felt less honest. Jonathan did not rescue her. Annie looked at him. You're not going to answer for me? No. You want me to? I want you to decide. She thought about her mother. Evelyn would have told her that not every platform was vanity. Some were bridges. If you had been given one and could stand on it without losing yourself, you used it to help someone cross. I'll speak, Annie said. Briefly. Margaret smiled. Briefly is often best. The meeting continued for nearly an hour. Outside the boardroom windows, the afternoon shifted toward early evening. The fairway softened under the lower sun. Staff moved across the course with new instructions already beginning to circulate. A cooler was carried toward the back nine. A shade tent came out of storage near the maintenance shed. Small changes, maybe. But Annie had learned that people who called small changes meaningless were usually people who did not need them. When the documents were ready, Elaine placed the signature pages before Jonathan and the board representatives. The silver pens were picked up. Names were signed. Dates were written. The future of Palm Crest moved from intention into record. Annie watched her father sign last. Jonathan Reed. The name sat dark on the page. He capped the pen and looked at her. As of tomorrow, it begins. Annie looked through the window toward the 18th hole. It already did. Before anyone could answer, There was a knock at the boardroom door. Harris opened it and stepped in, his expression careful. "Mr. Reed," he said. "Mr. Whitmore is still on the property." Margaret frowned. "I thought he left." "He did not leave the grounds. He went to the bar lounge. Security says he's refusing to depart until he speaks with you privately." Jonathan's face did not change. "Did he ask to speak with Annie?" "No, sir." Annie gave a soft breath that was almost a laugh. "Of course he didn't." Thomas removed his glasses and folded them. "He is attempting to control the narrative before it leaves the club." Elaine closed her folder. "There are already members asking questions. Some recorded parts of the incident. It won't stay contained." Jonathan stood. "Then we won't treat it like something to contain." Margaret rose as well. "We should handle this carefully." "Yes," Jonathan said. "Carefully does not mean quietly." Annie stood with them. Her legs felt the long day now. The shot, the staff room, the meeting, the memories of her mother, Samuel's tears, Richard's voice. All of it sat somewhere behind her ribs, but she was not tired enough to leave the ending to men in a bar lounge. Jonathan looked at her. "You don't have to come." "I know," she said. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. They walked out together, down the hall toward the member lounge where Richard Whitmore waited among leather chairs, framed championship flags, and the last pieces of a world that still believed money could turn wrongdoing into inconvenience. As they approached, Annie heard his voice before she saw him. "I want Reed in here now," Richard barked, "and tell him to leave the girl outside. This is business." Annie stopped just beyond the doorway. Jonathan looked at her once, then he pushed the door open. The member lounge was cool, dim, and built for men who liked their comfort to look inherited. Leather chairs sat in pairs near low tables. Framed flags from old tournaments lined the walls. A television above the bar showed a baseball game with the sound off, while a bartender stood frozen behind polished wood, pretending to polish a glass that was already clean. Richard Whitmore stood near the center of the room with a drink in his hand and anger in his shoulders. His assistant hovered behind him, pale and silent. Two members sat by the far window, both old enough to know when a room had become dangerous. They did not leave. They only lowered their voices and watched. Richard turned when the door opened. "I said I wanted to speak to you privately," he said to Jonathan. Jonathan stepped inside. Annie entered beside him. Margaret, Thomas, Elaine, and Harris followed, not crowding the space, but making it clear no one intended to hide this in a corner. Richard's eyes went to Annie, then back to Jonathan. "This is exactly what I mean. You're letting a teenager turn a business matter into theater." Annie said nothing. She had learned that silence made certain people reveal more than questions ever could. Jonathan walked to the center of the room and stopped a few feet from Richard. "You refuse to leave the property." "I'm not leaving until we settle this. We settled it on the fairway." Richard laughed once. "No. You embarrassed me on the fairway. There's a difference." Thomas Keene moved toward one of the chairs but did not sit. "Mr. Whitmore, you were asked to leave after your guest privileges were suspended. That request still stands." Richard pointed toward him with the glass. "Judge, I respect you, but don't lecture me on procedure. I know how clubs work. I know how boards work. I know how men like us handle mistakes." Jonathan's expression did not change. "Men like us? You know what I mean. I'd rather hear you say it." Richard's mouth tightened. He took a sip he did not need. "Fine. People with responsibilities. People with assets. People who understand that a reputation can be damaged by one emotional afternoon if nobody behaves like an adult." Annie finally spoke. "Who was emotional?" Richard turned toward her. "Young lady, this conversation is above your head." Jonathan's voice cut in, low and firm. "Do not do that again." Richard looked at him. "Do what?" "Speak to my daughter as if she is furniture in a room where her name is the reason we are standing here." The bartender stopped moving the glass. Richard set his drink down with care. "I'm trying to solve a problem." "You are trying to purchase silence," Elaine said. He looked at her sharply. "And you are?" "You met me outside." "Elaine Porter, counsel for Reed Foundation." "Yes. Well, counsel, you may want to advise your client that public humiliation can become expensive." Elaine gave him a calm look. "Is that a threat or an offer?" Richard stared at her. then looked back to Jonathan. "I'm prepared to make a donation." Nobody spoke. He mistook that silence for interest, a significant one, to the youth program, the staff fund, whatever name you want to put on it. "I'll double the check. Triple it. $50,000 by Monday morning." Annie looked at the old tournament flags on the wall. Men had won those titles decades ago. Their names were stitched beneath dates, preserved with care. She wondered how many workers had washed those flags, dusted those frames, cleaned this room after rich men drank too much and called it networking. Jonathan said, "And in return?" Richard spread his hands. "In return, we all agree this was a misunderstanding that has been resolved. No formal report, no membership denial on record, no statement that makes me sound like some kind of bigot." Harris's jaw tightened. Margaret Bell spoke before Jonathan could. "You are asking us to lie. I am asking you to be practical. Practicality has excused a great deal in this club," Margaret said. "I'm not sure it has improved us." Richard's face hardened. "Margaret, don't pretend Palmcrest got where it is by moral purity. Every institution protects its friends," Thomas said, "and loses its soul one friend at a time." Richard looked around the room as if the walls themselves had become unreasonable. "I said things I shouldn't have said. Fine. I paid the money. What more do you want?" Annie turned back to him. "The truth," he scoffed. "The truth is I didn't know who you were." "No," Annie said. "That's your excuse. The truth is you thought I was nobody, so you treated me like nobody." The sentence seemed to remove the air from the lounge. Even the baseball game on the muted screen looked suddenly absurd, men running bases in silence while a real contest stood below it. Richard picked up his drink again, then set it down without drinking. "You want me to apologize? I already told you I don't need an apology forced out of you." "Then what?" "I want you to stop pretending the problem was that you didn't know my last name." Richard looked at Jonathan. "Are you going to let her keep talking to me like this?" Jonathan answered without looking away from him. "I'm listening because she is saying what you still refuse to hear." Richard's assistant stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Whitmore, perhaps we should—" "Be quiet," Richard snapped. The assistant stepped back, face tightening with the quick embarrassment of someone used to being spoken to that way. Annie noticed. So did Harris. So did Jonathan. Richard saw that he had made another mistake and tried to smooth it over. "I'm under pressure. This has been a long day." "For Samuel too," Annie said. His eyes flashed. "Don't compare me to a grounds worker." "There it is," Harris said quietly. Richard turned. "What?" Harris walked farther into the room. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of an older man who had spent years choosing caution and was tired of the taste of it. "Every time you try to defend yourself, you show us more clearly what you believe." Richard stared at him with contempt. "You're forgetting your place, Harris." "No," Harris said. "I think I finally found it." The two older members by the window exchanged a look. One of them, a white-haired man with a cane beside his chair, stood with difficulty. "My wife and I heard enough from the terrace," he said. Richard turned toward him, startled. "Robert, stay out of this." The old man adjusted his glasses. "I should have stepped in earlier. I didn't. That's on me. But I won't sit here now and pretend this is a misunderstanding." His wife, still seated, added, "We heard you call that girl an eyesore." Richard's face went rigid. "I did not." "You did," she said. "And you said people like her should be grateful to carry a basket." The room held the words without mercy. Elaine opened her folder and made a note. Richard pointed at her. "You are not recording this." "I'm documenting statements from witnesses," Elaine said. "This is outrageous." Jonathan stepped closer. "No, Mr. Whitmore. Outrageous was what happened before we entered this room. This is consequence." Richard's anger shifted again, turning desperate. "I have friends on the county board. I have donors tied to this club. You think you can shut me out without cost?" Margaret stood straighter. "There will be cost either way. For once, Palmcrest will pay the right one." Annie looked at Margaret and saw something she had not noticed before. Grief. Not dramatic grief, but the quiet ache of an older woman realizing she had loved a place enough to excuse it, and now had to love it differently or lose the last honest part of that love. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. Then I'll call my attorney. You may, Elaine said. Security will still escort you out. At that word, security, Richard looked toward the door. 2 uniformed guards stood in the hallway now. They were not aggressive. They did not need to be. Their presence told the room that Richard's time of refusing had ended. He looked at Jonathan one last time. You're making an enemy. Jonathan's voice was even. No. You made one of your own character. I'm simply declining to do business with it. Richard picked up his drink and finished it in one swallow. Then he placed the glass on the table with too much force. Annie watched him. Part of her expected one final insult. Part of her was tired enough to wish he would leave without giving the room another wound to carry. Richard turned toward her. For a moment, his face changed. Beneath the anger, beneath the humiliation, something smaller appeared. He looked at her not as the girl with the basket, not as Jonathan Reed's daughter, not as the champion who had beaten his challenge, but as someone whose existence had revealed a weakness he had spent years covering with money. I didn't know, he said. Annie answered softly. You didn't ask. His mouth moved, but no words came. Security stepped aside as he walked toward the door. His assistant followed, clutching a folder to his chest. Nobody stopped them. Nobody insulted him. That seemed to make the exit harder. Men like Richard knew how to fight attack. They were less prepared for dignity. At the doorway, Richard paused, not turning fully around. This club will regret this, he said. Thomas Keene replied, perhaps. But regret is not always a sign of error. Sometimes it is the cost of finally doing right. Richard left. The door closed behind him with a soft click. For several seconds, the lounge remained still. Then the bartender set the glass he had been polishing on the counter and exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for 20 minutes. Annie looked at the room. The leather chairs, the flags, the chilled air, the people who had finally spoken after years of careful quiet. The place was still Palmcrest. It still carried its history, its habits, its polished blind spots. But something had been named, and once a thing was named honestly, it became harder to hide. Jonathan turned to her. You all right? This time, Annie let herself think before answering. No, she said, but I will be. He nodded. That was the answer he respected most. Margaret came to stand beside them. Tomorrow's announcement will be difficult. Annie looked toward the door Richard had passed through. Good. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Annie said, easy changes usually don't change much. For the first time that day, Margaret smiled fully. Your mother must have been a remarkable woman. Annie felt the familiar ache open, then settle. She was. Jonathan put a hand gently between Annie's shoulders, not to guide her, only to remind her he was there. Outside the lounge windows, the sun had begun to lower over the course. Long shadows stretched across the fairway, touching the 18th green where the ball still waited in the cup until someone thought to retrieve it. A small white thing in a small dark hole, holding more truth than all the polished rooms around it. Jonathan asked Harris to have someone retrieve the ball from the 18th cup, not because he cared about keeping it, but because leaving it there felt unfinished. A young caddy named Marcus went without being told twice. He returned 10 minutes later with the ball cupped in both hands, careful as if he were carrying something breakable. Here it is, Miss Annie, Marcus said. Annie looked at the ball. Grass clung faintly to one side. There was a small scuff near the logo, probably from the cart path bounce before it found the green. It looked ordinary. That was what struck her most. A ball could look ordinary and still carry the weight of an afternoon no one would forget. Thank you, Marcus. He handed it to her, then hesitated. My sister's really going to be allowed to try out? Jada? Annie asked. His face brightened because she remembered the name. Yes, ma'am. She won't be trying out to prove she belongs, Annie said. She'll be coming to learn. That's different. Marcus nodded, though she could tell he was still learning how to trust a door that had never opened for his family before. After he left, Annie remained by the lounge window for a moment, turning the ball in her palm. The sun had dropped lower, laying gold along the fairway and turning the white bunkers soft at the edges. From this distance, the course looked peaceful again. That bothered her. Places could return to beauty too quickly after exposing ugliness, as if the grass itself had no memory. Her father stood beside her. What do you want to do with it? With what? The ball. Annie looked at the scuffed white surface. I don't know. Jonathan nodded. No rush. Margaret Bell, who had been speaking quietly with Thomas Keene near the bar, approached with the careful grace of someone who had spent a lifetime in rooms where emotions were folded before they were shown. Annie, she said, the board would like to include that ball in the announcement tomorrow, perhaps in a case, with a note about the beginning of the Open Fairway initiative. Annie closed her fingers around it. Margaret noticed. Unless you object, I don't want this to become a trophy about me. It was an extraordinary shot. It was also a cruel moment. Margaret absorbed that. You're right. Annie looked at the older woman and softened her tone. I'm not saying hide it. I just don't want children walking in here someday thinking the way to be welcomed is to perform a miracle while someone insults them. Thomas, who had come closer, said, Then we frame it differently. How? Jonathan answered. Not as the ball you sank to prove yourself. As the ball that proved the club had to change. Annie considered that. Her mother would have liked the distinction. Evelyn Reed had always cared about what a story taught after people stopped admiring the dramatic part. That might work, Annie said. Elaine Porter made a note. We can write a short plaque, something simple. No plaque yet, Annie said. Let the staff help decide what it says. Margaret nodded. That is fair. Harris entered the lounge with his jacket buttoned, though one side sat slightly uneven because of the check in his pocket. He looked tired, but not defeated. Samuel's daughter is on her way, he said. She lives about 20 minutes south. She'll take him home. Does he need a doctor? Annie asked. He says no. Medical staff says he should be checked if symptoms return. His daughter may insist. Good, Jonathan said. Please tell her any medical expense related to today will be covered by the club. Harris nodded. I will. Jonathan looked at Elaine. Add that to the immediate action list. Heat incident coverage, effective today. Elaine wrote it down. Harris lingered, his hands clasped in front of him. There's something else. A few staff members are asking whether Mr. Whitmore's suspension will hold. Margaret's expression tightened. They think we may reverse it. Harris did not answer quickly, which was answer enough. Jonathan looked toward the hallway through which Richard had left. Then we make it clear tonight. Written notice to staff before the public announcement. Richard Whitmore's guest privileges are suspended. His membership application is denied. Retaliation against any staff who witnessed or reports today's events will not be tolerated. Elaine looked up. I'll draft it. Annie said, use plain language. Not legal words nobody trusts. Elaine almost smiled. Plain language it is. Harris let out a breath. That will matter. For them? Jonathan asked. For all of us, Harris said. There are people here who've been waiting years to see if rules apply upward. That sentence stayed in the room. Rules apply upward. Annie liked the sound of it, not because it was clever, but because it was rare. They moved from the lounge back toward the staff hallway as evening settled over Palm Crest. On the way, they passed the dining terrace. A few members stopped talking. One older man lifted his cap slightly to Annie, not grandly, just enough to acknowledge her. She nodded back. Another woman gave a small smile that did not ask for anything. Those gestures did not repair the day, but they marked a shift in the weather. Samuel's daughter arrived, just as Annie and Jonathan reached the staff entrance. She was a woman in her 40s wearing scrubs, her hair pulled back, her car keys still in her hand. She moved fast, the way daughters move when they have spent years worrying about aging parents who insist they are fine. Daddy, she said, entering the staff room. What happened? Samuel tried to sit straighter. I got a little hot. A little hot? She looked at Harris. He collapsed, didn't he? Harris removed his cap. Yes, ma'am, he did. The woman's jaw tightened. Annie recognized the expression. It was the face of someone choosing whether to be polite before deciding truth deserved more room. I told him last summer this schedule was too much, she said. I told somebody at the front desk. Nobody called me back. Harris lowered his eyes. I'm sorry. I don't need sorry if nothing changes. It will, Jonathan said. She turned to him. She knew who he was. Annie could see that. But worry for her father outweighed any instinct to be impressed. And who are you promising for? Palm Crest, Jonathan said. As of tomorrow morning, my foundation oversees operations. But for today, I'm promising as the man responsible for making sure this does not happen again. Samuel's daughter studied him. "My name is Carla Turner." Jonathan extended his hand. "Jonathan Reed." She shook it. "Then I'll remember who said it." "Please do." Carla looked at Annie. Samuel had clearly told her something, because her face changed with recognition. "You're the young lady who helped him." "Yes, ma'am." Carla took Annie's hand in both of hers. "Thank you for stopping." The words were simple, but they reached Annie more deeply than the praise for her shot had. "I'm glad I was there." Carla glanced at the check on the table, then back at Annie. "Daddy says you made some rich man pay for running his mouth." Samuel groaned. "Carla." Annie smiled despite herself. "Something like that." "Good," Carla said. "More of them should." That broke the room's heaviness. Even Harris gave a short laugh. Before Samuel left, Annie placed the golf ball in his hand. He looked confused. "This isn't mine," he said. "It wouldn't have happened if you hadn't mattered enough for someone to stop," Annie said. "Will you hold on to it until tomorrow? We may use it for the announcement, but only if you're comfortable with how." Samuel stared at the ball in his palm. His fingers closed around it slowly. "All my life," he said. "I picked these up after other men were done with them." His voice caught, and he cleared his throat. "Never thought one would come back to me like this." Carla touched his shoulder. Annie looked away for a moment to give him privacy. When they walked Samuel out to his daughter's car, the staff gathered near the service entrance. Not a crowd, not a spectacle, just people coming to see one of their own leave safely. Darlene hugged him. Marcus opened the car door. Luis handed Carla a container of soup from the kitchen, for later, because hospital food is no good even when you're not at the hospital. Though nobody had said they were going to the hospital, Carla took it and laughed. "You sound like my aunt." "Your aunt must be smart," Luis said. Samuel eased into the passenger seat, tired but smiling now. Before Carla closed the door, he looked at Annie. "You play tomorrow?" Annie shook her head. "Tomorrow is for talking." Samuel made a face. "Talking is harder." "Yes, sir," Annie said. "It is." Carla drove away as the first lights along the cart path came on. The sky had gone purple near the palms. The course was still beautiful, but now Annie could see the hands behind it more clearly. The people who watered, trimmed, carried, cooked, washed, repaired, and endured. Jonathan stood beside her. "Ready to go home?" Annie looked back toward the clubhouse. Through the windows, she could see Elaine handing Harris a draft notice. Margaret speaking with staff she had likely passed for years without conversation. Thomas listening to Marcus as if a 16-year-old caddy deserved the full attention of a retired judge. "Not yet," Annie said. Jonathan followed her gaze. "What do you need?" "To help write tomorrow." He nodded. "Then we write it." They returned inside, not through the front entrance where members arrived, but through the staff door where the day's truth had first entered. That felt right to Annie. Some stories should begin where people usually stop looking. They returned through the staff door just as the kitchen was cleaning up after dinner service. The smell of roasted chicken, coffee, lemon cleaner, and warm bread hung in the hallway. Someone had left a radio playing low near the dish station. An old soul song fading under the clatter of pans. Palmcrest looked different from this side. Less polished. More human. The walls had scuff marks. The floor hummed with the effort of people finishing a long day. Annie liked it better. Harris led them into a small office near the employee lockers. It had 2 desks, a printer that sounded tired, a corkboard filled with shift schedules, and a framed photo of Palmcrest from the 1970s, when the trees were smaller and the membership even narrower. Elaine set her folder on the desk and opened her laptop. Jonathan pulled out a chair for Annie, but she did not sit right away. She walked to the corkboard and read the names: Samuel Turner, Darlene Price, Marcus Hill, Luis Ortega, Ruth Coleman, Ben Walters. Names written in marker, taped beside hours and duties. People treat what they can keep nameless as disposable. She had said it earlier, but seeing those names now made the sentence feel less like an argument and more like a responsibility. Elaine looked up. "We need 2 drafts. One for staff tonight, one for members, and press tomorrow morning." "Start with staff," Annie said. Jonathan nodded. "Agreed." Elaine placed her fingers on the keyboard. "Plain language?" "Plain language," Harris said before Annie could answer. His voice was tired but certain. They've earned that much. Annie sat. Jonathan took the chair beside her. Harris remained standing for a moment, then seemed to realize he no longer needed to posture like the manager between worlds and lowered himself into the other chair. Elaine began. Effective immediately. Palmcrest Golf Club is implementing emergency heat safety protocols. Annie raised a hand. Too cold. Elaine paused. All right. How would you begin? Annie thought of Samuel sitting with the cup in his hands. She thought of Carla saying she had called last summer and nobody answered. Today, one of our own collapsed while working in the heat, Annie said. That should not have happened. We are sorry, and we are changing how this club protects the people who keep it running, Elaine typed. Harris looked down at his hands. That's better, he said. Jonathan leaned back. Add Richard Whitmore's suspension, Elaine typed again. Richard Whitmore's guest privileges have been suspended, and his pending membership application has been denied following conduct that violated the standards of this club. Say what conduct, Annie said. Elaine looked at her. That may create legal exposure. Jonathan turned to Elaine. The exposure came from the conduct, not from naming it. Elaine accepted that. Following racist, classist, and abusive remarks made toward a guest he believed to be a staff member, as well as threats of exclusion from the property. Harris exhaled. That's the truth. Annie nodded. Keep it. They worked line by line. Water stations would be checked hourly. Staff could stop work for heat safety without member approval. Meal breaks could not be skipped because a round was running late. No employee would be punished for reporting mistreatment. A staff advisory group would be formed before the end of the month. Medical costs from Samuel's collapse would be covered. The $10,000 would begin an employee relief fund, not as charity, but as restitution. Harris stopped them there. Use the word restitution? Annie looked at him. Do you think staff will understand it? Yes, Harris said. And I think they'll appreciate that it's not being called generosity. Elaine left it in. The printer groaned when the notice came out. Harris took the first sheet and read it slowly. His eyes moved over every sentence. Annie watched him reach the line about racist and classist remarks and stop there. This club has avoided words like that for a long time, he said. Did avoiding them help? Jonathan asked. No, Harris said. It only made the people hurt by them feel unreasonable for noticing. He carried the notice to the staff room himself. Annie, Jonathan, and Elaine followed, but stayed near the doorway, while Harris stood before the workers who had gathered again. Kitchen staff, caddies, maintenance crew, servers still in white shirts, housekeeping, cart attendants, older employees with careful faces, younger ones trying not to look too hopeful. Harris cleared his throat. I'm going to read this as written, he said. Not summarize, not soften. Nobody spoke. He read the whole thing. His voice shook once when he reached Samuel's name, but he kept going. When he finished, the room stayed quiet. Then Ruth Coleman, the housekeeper, raised her hand slightly. Does that mean if a member calls me girl, I can report it? Harris swallowed. Yes. And not lose shifts? Yes. Louise crossed his arms. What if the member donates a lot? Jonathan stepped forward. Especially then. That got a few low murmurs. Not laughter. Not yet. Surprise. Marcus asked. What if nobody believes us? Elaine answered. Reports will be reviewed outside the club management chain. Witnesses can be named, but anonymous reports will also be allowed. Retaliation will be grounds for member discipline. Darlene tilted her head. You mean members can be disciplined? Margaret Bell had entered quietly behind them. She answered, yes, and some of us should have made that clear. Years ago, Ruth studied her. You mean that? Margaret held her gaze. I do. There were no cheers. Working people knew better than to celebrate promises before they survived contact with Monday morning. But shoulders lowered. Eyes met. The room breathed differently. After the staff meeting, they moved to the boardroom to draft the public announcement. This one required more care, not because the truth should be hidden, but because the message had to carry beyond Palmcrest without turning Annie into a spectacle. Elaine built the structure. Reed Foundation transition, immediate staff protections, Denial of Richard Whitmore's membership application. Launch of the Open Fairway Initiative. Annie read the paragraph about herself and crossed out 3 lines. Elaine blinked. You removed National Junior Champion. It can go later, not first. Jonathan looked at the page. Why? Because if the first reason people respect me is that I won something, we're teaching the same lesson Richard believed. That value has to be proven before dignity is given. Margaret, sitting across from her, nodded slowly. Then how should it read? Annie wrote by hand in the margin. Today, an 18-year-old guest stopped to help a Palm Crest employee who collapsed in the heat. She was then subjected to abusive remarks by a guest who believed she was a worker, and therefore beneath his respect. That belief has no place here. Elaine read it twice. That's strong. Is it true? Yes. Then use it. Jonathan watched her with the quiet pride of a father who knew better than to interrupt a daughter becoming more herself. The announcement grew from there. The Open Fairway Initiative would welcome young players from underserved communities. Equipment, coaching, transportation, and course access would be provided. Staff would be invited to nominate children and relatives. The first clinic would include Marcus's sister Jada, though not by name in the announcement. Annie would speak briefly at noon. By the time they finished, the clubhouse was nearly empty. Cleaning crews moved through the dining room. The bar lights had been dimmed. Outside, sprinklers ticked over the fairway in slow arcs, silver under the moon. Annie stepped out onto the terrace alone for a minute. The 18th hole was dark now, the flag only a pale shape in the distance. The place where Richard had stood was empty. The spot where the club had fallen at her feet had already disappeared into the grass. Jonathan came out carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her. "Decaf," he said, "before you accuse me of bad parenting." She smiled and took it. Mom would still say coffee after sunset is a reckless choice. Your mother thought many of my choices were reckless. She was usually right. Almost always. They stood together in the night air. For a while, neither spoke. The quiet was not empty. It held the day without demanding more from it. Finally, Annie said, "I don't want tomorrow to be about humiliating Richard." "It won't be. I mean it. What he did was wrong, but if everyone just gathers to watch him fall, then nothing changes except the target." Jonathan looked toward the course. "Then tell them that tomorrow. I don't know if they'll listen. They listened today. Only after the ball went in." He turned to her. "No. Some listened before. Harris did. Samuel did. Marcus did. Your mother would say you don't measure the worth of truth by how quickly proud people accept it." Annie held the warm cup between both hands. "I miss her." Jonathan's voice softened. "So do I." The admission settled between them, familiar and new at the same time. Grief had become part of their family language. Not spoken every day, but always understood. Annie looked toward the staff entrance where Samuel had left with Carla. She would have liked him. She would have packed him food, scolded Harris, prayed for Richard, and corrected my speech twice before breakfast. Annie laughed quietly. "That sounds right." Jonathan smiled, then grew serious. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" "No." "Good. People who are too ready for microphones usually say less." She sipped the coffee, warm and bitter. Beyond the terrace, the sprinklers kept turning. Water reached the places that had been dry all day. Tomorrow, Palm Crest would open its doors and try to explain what had changed. But tonight, in the quiet after the shouting, Annie understood something her mother had tried to teach her for years. Justice was not a single strike, no matter how perfect. Justice was what people built after the sound faded. Morning came to Palm Crest with the kind of beauty that could make a person forget what the night had required. The fairways were washed in pale gold. The palms stood still after yesterday's wind, and the clubhouse windows caught the sunrise as if nothing ugly had ever been spoken beneath them. But Annie knew better now. So did everyone who arrived early through the staff entrance. By 7 o'clock, the kitchen was already awake. Coffee brewed in 2 large urns. Darlene carried trays of biscuits and fruit into the staff room, refusing help from anyone until Annie picked up a tray anyway. Louise had made egg sandwiches wrapped in foil for workers who usually ate standing near the loading dock. Marcus came in with his little sister Jada beside him, both of them dressed too neatly for a Saturday morning at a golf course. Jada wore a white polo tucked into khaki shorts, her hair pulled into two puffballs, and her hands clenched around the strap of a small backpack. Marcus spotted Annie and nudged his sister forward. "That's her." Jada's eyes widened. "You're Miss Annie?" Annie smiled. "Just Annie is fine. My brother said you hit a ball from forever away." Marcus groaned. "Jada." "What? You did say that." Annie bent slightly, so she was closer to the girl's height. "It was not forever. It only felt that way to some people." Jada looked serious. "Can I learn to do that?" "If you're willing to practice when it's boring," Annie said. The girl thought about it. "How boring?" "Very." Jada nodded. That made Annie laugh for the first time that morning. Jonathan came in a few minutes later with Harris, Elaine, Margaret, and Thomas. None of them wore the expression people wear before a celebration. They looked prepared, careful, and tired in the honest way that follows a hard decision made publicly. Harris had printed copies of the staff notice and placed them in the break room, maintenance shed, caddy station, kitchen, laundry area, and cart barn. He had also stood by the employee time clock himself, greeting people by name. Annie noticed. So did Ruth Coleman. "You practicing, Mr. Harris?" Ruth asked as she poured coffee. Harris looked at her. "Yes." Ruth took a slow sip. "Good. You need it." A few workers laughed. Harris smiled without defending himself. Yesterday, he might have explained. Today, he seemed to understand that accepting the correction was part of the work. At 8:30, Jonathan gathered everyone in the staff room before the public announcement. It was crowded now, people standing along the walls, sitting on counters, leaning near the door. Samuel was not there yet. Carla had taken him to urgent care the night before, and he had been told to rest for 48 hours. But at 8:34, the staff room door opened, and Samuel stepped in with Carla holding his arm and a look on her face that said she had lost the argument but won the right to supervise. The room clapped before anyone could stop it. Samuel waved one hand, embarrassed. All right. I didn't win the Masters. I just got dizzy." "You scared half the club," Darlene said. "Then half the club should have been paying attention sooner," Carla replied. That quieted the room, but not in a bad way. Carla helped her father into a chair. Marcus brought him water without being asked. Jonathan waited until Samuel settled, then spoke. "Yesterday, this club failed one of its own. Today, we start correcting that. Not with a speech alone. With policy, money, accountability, and habit." He looked around the room, making eye contact with employees, not scanning over them. "The Reed Foundation assumes operational oversight this morning. That gives us authority. But authority is not the same as trust. Trust will have to be earned." No one applauded. They listened. "The heat protocol is active now," he continued. "Water checks every hour. Mandatory breaks. No skipped meals because a member is impatient. Medical expenses related to yesterday are covered. The Employee Relief Fund begins with the $10,000 Mr. Whitmore was required to pay. It will not end there." Charles Bennett stood near the doorway, not inside the center of the room. He had come early and asked Harris where he could stand without making the moment about himself. Annie had heard that and respected it more than any speech he could have given. He had already signed paperwork for a recurring anonymous contribution, though by now half the staff seemed to know it was him and were politely pretending not to. Jonathan continued. "There will also be a reporting system outside club management. Members and guests will be held accountable for how they speak to staff. If someone calls you out of your name, threatens your schedule, insults your race, your background, your work, or your dignity, that will no longer disappear into a file no one reads." Ruth looked down at her coffee. Luis crossed his arms tighter, not in resistance, but as if holding something in place. Harris stepped forward. "I want to say something." Jonathan nodded. Harris removed his glasses, cleaned them with a cloth, then put them back on. It gave him a few seconds. Everyone let him have them. "I have managed this club for 17 years, he said. "There were days I did good work. There were days I kept the peace and called that good work. Yesterday reminded me peace is not the same as fairness. Sometimes peace just means the person being hurt has learned to be quiet." The staff room stayed still. Harris looked at Samuel. "Sam, I should have listened sooner." Samuel nodded once. Harris turned to Ruth, then Darlene, Luis, Marcus, Ben, and the others. All of you deserved better from me. I can't fix that with one statement, but I can start by not pretending I didn't know. Ruth watched him for a long moment. That's a start. Yes, ma'am, Harris said. It is. Annie stood near the back beside Jada. The girl leaned close and whispered, "Is he in trouble?" Annie whispered back, "He's taking responsibility." Is that the same thing? Sometimes it's what trouble is supposed to teach you. Jada seemed to consider this seriously. At 10 o'clock, the front lawn filled with members, local reporters, staff families, board members, and a handful of children invited quietly overnight from community programs Jonathan had already been funding. Nobody had expected so many to come. Word had moved through Palm Beach before breakfast. Some came because they cared. Some came because they were curious. A few came because they wanted to see if Richard Whitmore would appear. He did not. The podium stood near the first tee, but Annie had asked that the staff be placed in the front row, not behind the members. That small choice caused more murmurs than the legal announcements. Samuel sat beside Carla, wearing his palm crest cap. Marcus stood with Jada, who kept touching the junior putter someone had loaned her. Ruth and Darlene sat together. Luis stood near the end of the row with his arms crossed, watching the members watch them. Jonathan spoke first. He explained the transition, the safety reforms, the employee relief fund, and the suspension and denial of Richard Whitmore's application. He did not use Richard as entertainment. He stated the facts plainly, and the plainness made them harder to dismiss. Then he introduced Annie. For a second, she remained still. Microphones had always made her feel less certain than golf clubs. A club asked for discipline. A microphone asked for exposure. Jonathan stepped aside. Annie walked to the podium. The crowd looked larger from there. Faces, phones, sunglasses, folded arms, tilted heads. She found Jada in the front row, then Samuel, then her father. Finally, she looked toward the 18th hole, visible far beyond the crowd. "I was asked yesterday if I belonged here," Annie began. The lawn quieted. "I was not asked my name first. I was not asked why I was carrying a basket. I was not asked if the man I had stopped to help was all right. Someone looked at my skin, my clothes, and the work he thought I was doing, and decided that was enough to know my value." She paused. Her hands were steady on the sides of the podium. "I made the shot. People seem interested in that part. But I don't want the shot to be the whole story, because no child should need an albatross to be treated with dignity. No worker should have to collapse before a club remembers they are human. No person should have to reveal a famous last name before cruelty becomes unacceptable." A few heads lowered. Some in shame, some in thought. "My parents taught me that today, it has a chance to become something better." She looked toward the children gathered near the side of the lawn. "The Open Fairway Initiative will bring young players onto this course who may never have imagined themselves inside these gates. They will not come here as charity cases. They will come here as students, athletes, neighbors, and future champions if they choose to become them. They will not be told to know their place. They will be invited to build it." The crowd stayed quiet for half a breath, then applause began. Not loud at first, then stronger. Staff clapped. Families stood. A few older members rose slowly, then others followed. Annie stepped back before the applause could become too much. Jonathan touched her shoulder once as she passed. No words. None needed. After the announcement, reporters moved toward Jonathan, but Jada slipped between two adults and reached Annie first. "Do I still have to practice when it's boring?" she asked. Annie looked down at her and smiled. "Especially then." Jada sighed like this was a heavy burden, then grinned. Behind them, Samuel sat in the front row with the golf ball from the 18th hole resting in his palm. The plaque had not been written yet. The case had not been built. The story had not settled into history. But for that morning, it was enough that the ball was not locked behind glass. It was in the hand of a man who had spent years picking up what others left behind, while a club that had once looked past him finally learned his name. By afternoon, Palm Crest had become two places at once. On the surface, it was still a private golf club with white carts moving along trimmed paths, members ordering iced tea on the terrace, and reporters packing equipment near the first tee. But underneath, something had shifted. People who had worked there for years were saying each other's names a little louder. Members who had once passed staff with a nod were stopping, awkwardly at first, to ask questions they should have asked long ago. Some of it was clumsy, some of it was overdue. Annie knew better than to confuse a good morning with a changed culture. But she also knew beginnings rarely arrived, polished. The first clinic of the Open Fairway initiative was not supposed to happen that day. It had been planned for weeks later, with printed banners, prepared speeches, and a schedule approved by committees. Annie asked to move it up. "Today?" Elaine said, looking at her over a stack of press folders. "We have no registration table, no media plan, no waivers prepared for a full session." "Then don't make it a full session," Annie said. "Make it an invitation." Jonathan looked at her from across the boardroom table. "How many children?" "Whoever is already here. Staff families, the kids from the community program." Jada, Elaine sighed, but it was not refusal. "We can do a short introductory clinic, pudding only. No full swings until waivers are signed." "That's fine," Annie said. "Pudding is where patience starts." Harris, who had been standing near the door with a radio clipped to his belt, gave a small nod. "I can have the practice green cleared in 15 minutes. "Not cleared," Annie said. "Opened." He understood the difference. Opened, then. By 2 o'clock, a small group of children stood near the practice green, some in sneakers, some in borrowed polos, some holding clubs for the first time as if they were afraid of dropping something expensive. Their parents and grandparents gathered behind a low rope that had once separated spectators from players. Annie asked Harris to remove it. "Are you sure?" he asked. She looked at the rope, then at the children. "That's the whole point, isn't it?" Harris unclipped it himself. Jada stood at the front, trying very hard not to look nervous. Marcus hovered nearby in his caddy uniform until Annie waved him over. "You're not working this part," she said. "You're her brother." Marcus looked toward Harris. Harris nodded. "Go on." Marcus stepped beside Jada. She relaxed immediately. Annie began without a microphone. She did not want the children to feel like they were at a ceremony. She wanted them to feel grass under their shoes and a club in their hands. "First thing," she said, holding up a putter, "golf is not about being rich. Some people tried to make it look that way for a long time. But the game itself doesn't care about your last name. It cares whether you can listen." A boy of about 10 raised his hand. "Listen to who?" "The ground," Annie said. "The wind, your own body, sometimes your coach, not always the loudest person nearby." A few parents laughed softly. She placed a ball on the practice green. "Putting looks simple, so people rush it. Don't. Simple things can tell the truth about you. Can you be patient? Can you pay attention? Can you miss without getting mean?" Jada frowned at the ball. "What if everybody is watching? Then you breathe anyway. What if they laugh?" Annie looked at her. "Then you still get to decide who you become next." The answer made the adults behind them go quiet. It was one thing to teach a child where to place her hands. It was another to teach her that other people's cruelty did not have to become the weather inside her chest. Annie showed them how to stand, how to hold the putter lightly, how to read the slope. She did not overload them with terms. She had seen too many adults turn instruction into a performance of their own expertise. Children did not need to be impressed. They needed to be invited. "Soft hands," she told one boy whose grip looked like he was choking the club. "The ball isn't trying to escape." He loosened up and missed by 3 feet. "Good," Annie said. He looked confused. "I missed. You learned the first roll. Now you know more than you did before." He grinned and tried again. Jada's first putt rolled too hard, crossed the hole, and stopped near Samuel's shoe. Samuel had insisted on watching from a chair under a new shade tent, with Carla beside him and a cooler of water within arm's reach. He bent slowly, picked up the ball, and rolled it back to Jada. "Try asking it nicer," he said. Jada giggled. "Golf balls don't listen." Samuel raised his eyebrows. "Then you haven't known them long enough." The second putt stopped just short of the cup. Jada groaned. Annie crouched beside her. "What did it teach you? To hit it harder?" "Maybe. What else?" Jada looked at the slope. "It turns at the end. There you go." The third putt fell in. Jada stared at the cup as if it had opened a door. Marcus clapped first, too loud and too proud. Other children joined in. Jada tried not to smile and failed completely. Across the green, Charles Bennett stood beside the white-haired member from the lounge. He had changed from polished embarrassment into something quieter. He was not performing repentance. He was holding a basket of balls and handing them to children when they needed another try. At one point, a little boy asked if Charles worked there. Charles looked startled, then said, "Today? I suppose I do." The white-haired member laughed. "Best job you've had in years." Charles accepted that with a nod. Not everyone approved. Near the terrace, a pair of members watched with stiff faces. One woman whispered to another, "It's all happening rather fast." Ruth Coleman, passing behind them with a tray of lemonade, paused and said, "Not for those of us who waited years." Then she kept walking. The women said nothing after that. Jonathan saw the exchange and looked at Annie. "She'll be on the advisory group," Annie said. "She may end up chairing it," Jonathan replied. As the afternoon lengthened, the clinic became less formal. Parents stepped closer. A grandfather who said he had played municipal courses in the 1970s showed a boy how to line up his feet. Darlene brought cups of lemonade. Luis arrived with chicken salad sandwiches cut in halves because, as he put it, kids swing better when they aren't starving. Ben, the groundskeeper, explained why greens could not be treated like living room carpet. The children listened to him with more attention than many members ever had. Annie watched Ben kneel and run his hand over the grass. "This grows," he told them. "You take care of it, it takes care of the game." A girl with braids asked, "Like people?" Ben looked at her, then smiled. "Exactly like people." That moment stayed with Annie. Near 4 o'clock, Elaine came to the practice green with her phone in hand. "The announcement is spreading." Annie braced herself. "Bad?" "Mixed. Mostly strong support, some criticism, a few people saying Palmcrest is becoming political." Jonathan joined them. "Treating workers like humans is always called political by people who preferred the old arrangement." Elaine nodded. "There's also a statement from Richard Whitmore's office." Annie looked toward the 18th fairway. "Already?" Elaine read from the screen. "Mr. Whitmore regrets that a private moment at Palmcrest Golf Club was mischaracterized. He remains committed to opportunity, sportsmanship, and respectful dialogue." Samuel, close enough to hear, snorted. "That man wouldn't recognize respectful dialogue if it drove his cart." Carla gave him a look. "Daddy." "What?" Doctor said rest. "Didn't say lie." Annie shook her head, not quite smiling. "Let him have his statement." Jonathan watched her. "You're sure? It doesn't change what happened." "No," Elaine said, "but it may shape what some people believe." Annie looked back at the children putting on the green. Jada had missed again and was now explaining slope to a younger boy with the authority of someone who had discovered it 20 minutes earlier. "Then we shape what comes next," Annie said. The sun dropped lower, softening the edges of the course. The children began to leave with borrowed clubs, paper schedules, and the kind of tired excitement that makes parents quiet on the drive home. Jada did not want to give back the putter. Marcus whispered something to her. She sighed and handed it to Annie. Annie held it out again. "Keep it for the week. Bring it back Saturday." Jada's mouth fell open. "For real?" "For practice. Very boring practice." "I can do boring." "I believe you." Marcus looked at Annie, his gratitude too big for words. She saved him from having to find them. "Make sure she practices on carpet," Annie said. "No putting into lamps." He laughed. "Yes, ma'am." When the last family left, Annie walked to the edge of the practice green. The grass was marked with footprints, the neatness interrupted by use. She liked it better that way. Jonathan came up beside her. "You changed the schedule." "A little." "You removed the rope." "That too." He looked at the green where children had stood. "Your mother would have removed it first." Annie smiled. "Then told you to stop holding the clipboard." She often did. They stood in the fading light while staff folded the shade tent, not because the staff had to, but because several members were helping badly enough that Darlene had to correct them twice. It was imperfect, awkward, human. Palmcrest was still Palmcrest. Its history had not vanished in a day. Richard's words had not disappeared from memory. Samuel's collapse had not become less serious because people now carried water bottles. But children had crossed onto the green. Workers had spoken and been heard. A rope had come down. Annie looked toward the 18th hole, then back at the practice green. For the first time since Richard had thrown the driver at her feet, She felt something close to hope, not the shiny kind people put in speeches, but the working kind. The kind that arrives with schedules, names, water coolers, and a little girl practicing a putt on carpet because someone finally told her she was welcome. The next morning, Annie returned to Palmcrest before sunrise. The gates were open, but the club was still quiet. No reporters, no members on the terrace, no boardroom folders, no voices carrying across the fairway. A maintenance cart moved in the distance with its lights on. Sprinklers ticked somewhere near the fourth hole. The air smelled of wet grass, salt from the coast, and coffee from the kitchen starting up behind the clubhouse. Annie walked alone at first, carrying her own driver this time. She wore the same old golf shoes Richard had mocked. She had thought about changing them, then decided not to. They had carried her through junior tournaments, bad weather, long practice days, and the kind of loneliness that came with being the only black girl in a field of players who looked nothing like her. They were not elegant, but they were honest. Annie trusted honest things. The 18th hole waited beneath a thin layer of morning mist. It looked softer now. Yesterday it had felt like a courtroom. This morning, it was only a golf hole. Long fairway, sand guarding the approach, green sloping toward the cup. Flag hanging almost still in the pale light. Without Richard's voice, without the laughter, without the eyes waiting for her to fail. The place seemed smaller, not less difficult, just less powerful. Annie stopped at the tee and looked down the fairway. She thought about the ball now sitting on Samuel Turner's kitchen table. He had taken it home after the clinic, wrapped in a clean handkerchief Carla found in her purse. The plaque had still not been written. Annie liked that. Some things needed to belong to people before they belonged to history. Behind her, soft footsteps came along the cart path. "You always did like getting up before the world could bother you," Jonathan said. Annie turned. Her father carried 2 paper cups of coffee and wore a windbreaker over his polo. His hair was still damp from a shower, and he looked more like a father than a chairman, which Annie preferred. "Is one of those decaf?" she asked. "For you. And yours? I am a grown man who makes his own poor decisions." Annie took the cup and smiled. Mom would have disagreed with half that sentence. She disagreed with most of my sentences. Improved them, usually. They stood together without speaking for a while. That had always been one of the safest parts of their relationship. Jonathan did not rush silence just because he had words available. Finally, he looked toward the green. "Do you think about the shot?" Annie watched the flag move once in the light breeze. "Not the way everyone else does." "How do you think about it?" "I think about Mr. Samuel going down in the heat. I think about that woman in the cart who slowed down, asked if he was okay, then kept driving. I think about Marcus asking if his sister could come here. I think about Richard saying he didn't know who I was." Like that explained anything. Jonathan nodded. It explained more than he meant it to. Annie took a sip of coffee. It was warm and bitter. "I don't want to spend my life proving people wrong." "You shouldn't have to. But sometimes you do." "Yes," Jonathan said. "Sometimes. That's the part that makes me tired." He looked at her then, not as the young champion, not as the face of a new initiative, but as his daughter. "I know." The answer was simple, and because it was simple, it did not insult the weight of the truth. Annie set her coffee on the bench beside the tee markers. "I keep hearing Mom. What is she saying?" "Don't let ugly make you ugly." Jonathan looked down, smiling in a way that hurt. "She said that to me more than once. I believe it. She said it because I needed it. So do I." He turned toward her. "You weren't ugly yesterday. I wanted to be. That's not the same thing." Annie picked up her driver and ran her thumb over the grip. "When Richard walked away, part of me wanted him to feel small forever." Jonathan did not flinch. "That's human. Mom would have prayed for him." "Yes. Would you?" Jonathan breathed out slowly. Not as quickly as she would have. Annie laughed under her breath. "That's honest. Your mother had a way of seeing the wound inside the person holding the knife. I admired it. I also found it inconvenient." Annie looked toward the clubhouse, where the first kitchen lights had come on. "Seeing the wound doesn't mean letting them keep the knife." "No," Jonathan said. "It means taking the knife seriously." They stood with that for a moment. A cart approached slowly from the staff path. Harris was driving, with Samuel beside him. Carla had probably argued against it. Samuel's posture suggested he had won only by promising not to lift anything heavier than a coffee cup. He wore his palm crest cap and a light jacket, and in his lap sat the golf ball wrapped in the handkerchief. Harris stopped a few yards away. "Morning," he said. "Didn't mean to interrupt." "You didn't," Annie said. Samuel lifted the handkerchief. "Figured this belonged here for a minute before it goes anywhere else." Annie stepped closer. "You didn't have to bring it." "I know. That's why I did." Jonathan smiled. "How are you feeling, Sam?" "Carla says I'm stubborn. Doctor says I'm dehydrated." "I say both can be true." Harris gave him a look. "You are supposed to be resting." "I'm sitting in a cart, aren't I?" Annie laughed softly. Samuel held out the ball. "I thought about what you said, about letting staff help write the plaque. And I got one sentence." Annie took the ball but kept her eyes on him. "Let's hear it." Samuel cleared his throat. "No one should have to be mistaken for someone important to be treated with respect." No one spoke for a moment. Jonathan's face changed first, not dramatically, just a softening around the eyes. Annie looked down at the ball in her hand. "That's the plaque." Samuel blinked. "Just like that?" "Just like that." Harris nodded. "I'll have it made." "Don't make it fancy," Samuel said. "Fancy makes people stop reading." Jonathan smiled. "Plain words. Clear letters." "Good." The sun began to rise fully then, burning the mist from the fairway. The 18th hole stretched ahead, open and quiet. Annie placed the ball back in Samuel's hand. "Would you keep it until the case is ready?" she asked. Samuel looked surprised. "You trust me with it?" "Yes, sir." His fingers closed around it. "Then I'll keep it safe." From across the course came the sound of children's voices. Annie turned and saw Marcus walking toward the practice green with Jada and two other kids from yesterday's clinic. Jada was carrying the borrowed putter like it was a flag. She saw Annie and waved with her whole arm. "Miss Annie," she called. "I practiced on the carpet. I only hit one chair." Marcus groaned. "You were not supposed to tell her that." "One chair is progress," Annie called back. Jada grinned and ran toward the green. Harris watched the children, then looked at Jonathan. "Never thought I'd see that before 7 in the morning at Palm Crest." Jonathan said, "Get used to it." The words held more promise than ceremony. Annie returned to the tee. She set down a new ball, not the one from yesterday, just an ordinary ball from her bag. For a moment, everyone understood without being told that this swing was not for Richard, not for reporters, not for proof. It was for the game itself. For the girl she had been. For her mother's voice. For Samuel's sentence. For Jada, on the practice green. For every child who would walk through the front gate without being asked who had let them in. She took her stance. The breeze was softer than yesterday's. The club felt familiar in her hands. She did not need to fight the wind this time. She only needed to listen. Jonathan stood behind her. Harris remained by the cart. Samuel held the old ball in his lap. In the distance, Marcus showed Jada how to set her feet, and she corrected him with the confidence of someone who had been welcome for almost 24 hours and already intended to stay. Annie drew the club back and swung. The sound was clean. The ball rose into the morning, white against the blue, carrying over the fairway with an easy line. It did not need to go in. That was the difference. It was not a wager, not a defense, not a miracle demanded by insult. It was simply a shot struck by a young woman who knew where she stood. It landed far down the fairway and rolled into the light. Annie watched until it stopped. Jonathan came beside her. "Good shot. Not an albatross." "No." She picked up her coffee. "Still good. Still good," he agreed. They began walking down the fairway together, not hurried, not watched by a crowd. Behind them, the clubhouse doors opened for the morning. Staff moved through them by name. Children gathered on the practice green. A rope that had once marked distance from belonging lay coiled near the shed, unused. Palmcrest had not become perfect overnight. No place did. There would be arguments, resistance, old habits dressed as tradition, and people who missed the days when comfort mattered more than truth. But something had started that could not be easily folded away. A man had been seen, a girl had been heard, a gate had opened, a promise had been made in plain language. Annie looked toward the green at the end of the hole and thought of her mother. Justice is not always fair in the way it arrives. Sometimes it comes late. Sometimes it comes quietly. But when it comes, stand ready. Yesterday, justice had sounded like a ball dropping into a cup. Today, it sounded like children laughing on a practice green, like Samuel Turner's name spoken with care, like Harris greeting workers at the time clock, like a father walking beside his daughter without needing to protect her from the truth she had already faced. And sometimes, Annie thought, justice did not need to shout. Sometimes it was a young black woman standing on a field where someone had told her she did not belong, lifting her club in the morning light, and swinging anyway. The lesson of this story is that a person's worth should never be judged by skin color, clothing, job, or social status. Annie was disrespected because powerful men thought she was someone they could look down on, but her dignity was already real before anyone learned her name. True character is revealed in how we treat people who seem to have no power over us. Justice does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes through quiet courage, a kept promise, and the simple act of standing firm when the world tries to make you feel small. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.